Chapter 522. Damien and Joseph looked back in horror, their eyes widening in shock. What should have been a frail young woman suddenly became a monster in their eyes. There was nothing about her innocent expression that left them with any sort of ease any longer. The amount of torque you would need to twist a human's head off, let alone from such an odd position, was enough to make them shiver down to their cores. This young woman looked no different from any other in her early 20s. Yet, the strength she displayed was beyond the realms of reason. "Keep running," Joseph barked. The young woman continued to observe the running group, her breathing hiccuping into a bubbling giggle every so often. It was as though she had overexerted her body, but her brain had yet to register the fact. It short-circuited, trying to decide whether she should prioritize laughing or breathing deeply. Damien and the others entered a state of high alert. It was at that moment that the guards began to flood out of the cracked walls one after another, some quickly catching up to some of the prisoners who hadn't spent their time escaping but rather on other matters. But, it was then that the first arrows were released. It was so swift that it didn't even make a single sound beneath the chorus of excited roars and insane laughter. A guard who had just snapped the arm of a prisoner while twisting their limb back suddenly found a bloody hole between their brows. The prisoner blinked with curiosity, crimson splattering all over his face. His tongue whipped out, tagging the corner of his lip. He spit out the blood as soon as he tasted it, finding it not too pleasing. Then, without much thought, he snapped his arm back into place and continued running with everyone else, curiosity lighting his eyes. Despite the fact he had just seen a person die for the first time in his life, he didn't seem to feel any particularly special way about it. It was a complete slaughter. Every guard that stepped into the clearing was instantly sniped. The precision of the Hargrove City archers seemed to be even beyond the elite snipers of Earth. They acted as though in tacit agreement, not wasting a single arrow. Earth was very quickly finding out that there were some matters far more important than just talent. While the people of Earth were fighting to protect their home, the people of Terrain were fighting for their futures. Not just their own futures, but that of their families and loved ones. Losing was not an option. Hundreds of prisoners made their way across the clearing, their confidence growing with each passing moment. The efficiency of the archers gave them this very confidence to the point where many began to smile. They finally saw an end to their nightmare. Of course, those smiling individuals weren't among the madmen designated with AS and DS across their chests. There were no small number of C and B grade prisoners who lost their lives at their hands. "City Lord, is it really alright to let things continue like this?" Every City Lord had a right-hand man. For City Lord White, it had been the secretary, Naya. For City Lord Hargrove, it was an elder man who seemed even older than the skinny, graying City Lord. This older man, dressed quite like a butler, was known as Salnaz. Hargrove continued to observe the situation, not answering immediately. In response, Salnaz couldn't help but press again. There's clearly a reason why Earth decided to lock many of them away. Though they're clearly very powerful, they've all lost their minds. How can we expect to control them? They might end up being our downfall instead. Salnaz finished, his tone somewhat somber. Though he spoke these words, in order to ensure that his actions wouldn't dampen the morale of the men, he controlled his voice so that only the City Lord could hear him. After all, every small advantage they could grab a hold of was a plus. They couldn't allow Earth the slightest chink in their armor. "Salnaz, I think it's best you don't ask for answers to questions you aren't qualified to have." The sudden indifferent voice caught Salnaz off guard. He felt as though a blade was suddenly firmly pressed against his back, prepared to take his life at the slightest sign of impropriety. Salnaz gulped, his frail old body shivering. "Yes, young heir Anared. I apologize, I've stepped out of line." Salnaz struggled to speak through gritted teeth, the beating of his heart growing erratic. Even to now, he didn't dare to turn around to face Anared, who had most definitely appeared behind him. He simply lowered his head, trying to stop the trembling of his body. When did this child grow so powerful? Salnaz felt as though Anared could take his life whenever he pleased. But, logically, this young heir who was nothing more than a little boy in Salna's eyes should have still been several decades away from displaying such strength. However, when Salnas thought of a certain possibility, his trembling only became worse. Hargrove frowned slightly and swept a gaze back in Anared's direction. Something like reprimanding another subordinate was definitely crossing a line of respect. It was even worse that Anared had actually been listening in on what should have been a private conversation. In any other situation, this would have led to a battle of city lords. But, even Hargrove seemed to feel some trepidation when facing Anared now. Just when Hargrove made the choice to swallow his pride and was about to try to alleviate the tension with some words, the ground quaked. Are they finally getting serious? Hargrove turned his frown toward Dark Cloud Prison. He knew well that Earth wouldn't leave this place unprotected. This prison was too much of a strategic point. In fact, even Terrain was aware of this, or else Anared would have never been sent here. The portions of the hexagonal prison that appeared above ground suddenly collapsed. No. They didn't collapse, rather, they sunk into the ground, being swallowed beneath the concrete. Just after this happened, the hollow center that the prison once surrounded opened, separating like the jaws of a hidden beast. A platform slowly raised. At first, it was impossible to see anything atop of it. But, very soon, the shadows of men and women became clear. By the time the platform's gears grinded to a halt and appeared above ground, one could see a troop of over 10,000 warriors led by lead guard Garwin and Governor Duke Owen. Chapter 523. Joseph and Damien looked back after hearing the clicking of the gears. They had put their all into running and avoiding the and dark prisoners around them, but hearing such a loud commotion, they couldn't help themselves. When they saw the sudden appearance of the Dark Cloud prison guards, and in such a large number at that, they felt as though their legs couldn't carry them fast enough. There was just half a kilometer between them and the city gates. To well-trained men like them, even before the metamorphosis, this was a matter of a 2 or 3 minute run at most. Yet, these few minutes felt like the longest they had experienced in their lifetimes. Escobar scanned the situation emotionlessly. It was as though he couldn't see the archers aiming their bows toward him. His gaze landed on each and every one of the guards that had fallen, the billowing of his mustache becoming deeper with each passing moment. Even with the long cycles of his breath, it felt as though the wind around the warden was kicking up, responding to his will in large swaths. Mow them down, he commanded coldly. At that moment, the clicking of guns sounded. City Lord Hargrove's pupils constricted. That's impossible. Heavy military boots stepped forward before they each kneeled, pressing their rifles to their shoulders. And then, the bullets rained. As quickly as the guards had fallen, the prisoners fell even faster. How could the fire rate of archers match the pace of semi-automatic weaponry? Shit! Damien growled, his feet stamping against the ground. A surge of earth followed his command, peeling concrete jetting into the air to cover his back. Don't panic. Those are normal gunpowder-based weapons. Joseph roared. Keep running. Using the cover Damien gave them, Joseph and the others crossed the final remaining distance to the city, anxiousness clear in their demeanors. Damn it. Open the gate. Joseph roared through gritted teeth, but the doors of the city remained firmly closed. By now, the crowd beneath the city gates was growing, and there were already more than 100 that had made it this far, while several thousand more were crossing the final distance. But those of Hargrove City didn't seem to hear what was going on below. Joseph's heart was gripped with despair. Could this really be a ploy by the Empire? No, that didn't make any sense. Just what was going on? Joseph no longer seemed to have the calm-headedness he once displayed. His decision-making became cloudy, and he banged on the gates just like all the others, unable to think for himself. He was practically brought to the point of tears, as though he could see his life flashing before his very eyes. Hargrove watched this scene from above silently. It seems they understand their situation now, he said coldly. Lower the platforms. Finally, the warriors of Hargrove City began to move. But they didn't open the gates as many would have expected them to. Rather, they began to lower platforms from the top of the walls. As a veteran of governance, Hargrove understood the truth of human nature, and it would be the truth no matter which world one was born in. If things came too easy, they wouldn't be appreciated. Very easily, a great boon could become bland, a life-saving grace could be expected, and a savior could become just a person doing as they should. When annexing such a large group of people, Hargrove needed them to understand who held the power and who didn't. As for the few who died in proving this point, who cared? Seeing the platforms descending, the group of prisoners that had been wailing below suddenly began to cheer. They didn't even consider the fact their lives would still be in danger or that many more could have been saved had Hargrove chosen a different method. It was exactly as Hargrove expected. This was human nature. Down. Escobar commanded coldly. Shields at the ready. Charge. Governor Duke Owen didn't stay back. His aging body seemed even more agile than the youngsters, pouncing forward with vigor. He realized that platforms presented an opportunity. It was impossible for the thousands of prisoners that had escaped to successfully climb upon those platforms before they crossed the remaining distance. From a cursory calculation, there was only enough space for 100 people at a time, and it took half a minute for a round trip to be completed. Of course, Governor Duke Owen wasn't foolish enough to use these platforms to try and climb the city wall. That would be asking for death. However, the existence of the platforms would make breaching the gates much easier. City Lord Hargrove might have wanted to teach the prisoners a preemptive lesson with his actions, but he seemed to have not considered the fact that it would be impossible to use the archers to stop their siege if the very platforms they were using protected the warriors of Earth from above. Seeing such actions though, Hargrove sneered. Dark Cloud Prison was a place with maybe the tightest security on Earth with the exception of the Royal Palace. It could be said that in order to become a guard here, you had to be an elite amongst elites. Even those who weren't handpicked for this job from the very beginning had been high-ranking military officials before their placement. This was all to say that the group of men and women that followed Governor Duke Owen now were all powerful combatants. However, they were all powerful combatants without the slightest idea on how to siege a city. Both men looked toward one another as though they were looking at a fool. But only a real clash would tell just who was right and who was wrong. Unfortunately, whether or not that clash would happen would soon become an unknown. Bang! 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 Just when Governor Duke Owen had already crossed the halfway mark to Hargrove City, space solidified. Another swath of charging warriors froze, unable to move a single inch. This wasn't out of fear, no. They were physically unable to control their bodies. As though they had suddenly been placed into a hardened mold of concrete, everything from their limbs even to their facial muscles didn't seem capable of budging even the slightest. The central platform the guards and Warden Owen had just come from splintered into two. Slowly, a group of prisoners, each with bright red #D tags on their chests, made their way up. The air around them seemed heavy beyond compared to the point where even the archers on Hargrove City's walls couldn't budge an inch. At the head of these dark prisoners, a lanky man with messy dirty blonde hair stood. His back was hunched and his arms were still crossed in his straitjacket. From the front, it was simply impossible to see his facial expressions because his gaze faced the ground, allowing his hair to block whatever view one might have had otherwise. His bare feet scraped along the ground, his legs barely raising as he walked forward. Yet, even as this group began to move, no one else seemed capable of doing so. A cold sweat began to bead down City Lord Hargrove's forehead. Even he struggled to move, even twitching his fingers felt as though he was lifting several tons of weight. This ability, whatever it was the most powerful he had ever seen. No. Even if he included those monsters he had heard of during his over a century worth of life. None could compare to this. Chapter 524. There seemed to be only 7 of them. No. 8. 9. The number kept changing. It should have been simple to conclude that one of them had a cloning ability, but through this thickening wall of space, let alone moving, even senses didn't seem to work properly anymore. It felt as though one was trying to cast a net several kilometers away despite the fact the group was at most several hundred meters away. As if this wasn't fear-inducing enough, while a normal distance felt like forever to everyone else. To the group, it was barely a short stroll. Though they seemed to be walking normally, they covered large distances as though they were sprinting with all their might. Not even a few seconds later, the group reached the vanguard of the dark cloud prison guards. It was only then Lionel's steps suddenly paused. In perfect unison, the group came to a pause with him. It was hard to tell what Lionel had promised these dark prisoners in not even half an hour since their attempted escape began to make them treat him like this. But the reality was displayed before them all regardless. "I recognize you." Lionel's voice was quite striking in such a suddenly quiet environment. Unlike what one expected, it wasn't deep and gruff, nor did it have some evil air to it. Rather, it sounded like the normal voice of a teenage boy on the cusp of adulthood. Yet, one couldn't help but feel an instinctive fear toward it. It seemed to seep into their ears and host the beating of their hearts. As though a master plucking at their strings, he was a controller of their fate. "AI, that's right. You were there the day they took me away from my mother." Lionel slowly walked toward Governor Duke Owen, his head still lowered to the ground. He painted quite an odd picture. Everything from his bare feet to his straitjacket seemed completely out of place. Escobar's gaze narrowed, his body still finding it difficult to move even the slightest bit. Despite the fact the boy's face was lowered and the prisoner tag that should have been across his chest was covered by a straitjacket didn't stop the warden from recognizing Lionel immediately. He didn't say a word. Or rather, he couldn't say a word even if he wanted to. Even moving his lips was difficult. Despite the fact Earth was new to this new world order, Escobar was still aware that such an indomitable ability shouldn't possibly exist. All abilities should have limitations, weaknesses. Something like locking down the space within several hundred meters should have been absolutely impossible unless one was a higher dimensional being. However, what the Governor Duke didn't know was the fact there were indeed existences capable of such feats. And they were known as savants. Savants were existences capable of breaking the limiters of their abilities. Whether it be the issue of stamina, duration, or realm of influence, they didn't need to worry about any of this. This wasn't simply because they were able to rely on themselves, but rather because universal force naturally fueled their every action. Whereas those like Lionel or the Warden would have to comprehend universal cycles in order to use universal force. Savants had no need for such a thing. They could make use of the universe's strength as they pleased. The result of this were abilities that seemed more like the act of gods rather than mere mortals. And, in fact, on some worlds, these people were indeed known as gods. However, the price to pay for being a savant wasn't non-existent either. Much like how mortal savants of Earth were only good at one particular task, the same could be true of the savants of the dimensional verse. Outside of their abilities, the talents savants had were severely limited. Cultivating force, comprehending styles or universal cycles, even awakening lineage factors they might have been born with was all impossible. But, with such power, did they need such supplementary strengths? Lionel's hair shook somewhat. It seemed like he was shaking his head or lamenting something, or maybe he was thinking through something. He didn't have any care to give, just silently standing there as though the world would wait upon his every whim. "Where is my mother?" Finally, Lionel settled down on these words. But the cold sweat of Escobar's back only grew despite the stoicism of his face. In the moments Lionel remained silent, he could feel the struggle of the youth before him. Lionel's every instinct screamed to kill him, yet, as though he was internally speaking to himself in attempts to calm down, he remained silent. In the end, Lionel decided that he wanted to know about his mother more than he wanted to kill this warden before him. "Vice, it seems the man can't speak, release him," Lionel said slowly. Within the group, a man who looked about 27 or 28 years old picked at his nose. Snot ran down his face, but he didn't seem to mind in the slightest. This man was none other than Vice, the wielder of the ability so many here feared so much. Vice flicked a booger toward Escobar. Only then did the warden almost collapse, finally able to move under the normal laws of physics. Speak. Lionel said plainly, his voice still as even as it always was. Where is my mother? What did you do to her? Escobar coughed, feeling as though he could finally breathe normally. He pulled himself up to stand straight and tall. When he stood to his full height, he was still quite a bit shorter than Lionel despite the fact the latter had his head lowered and his back hunched. But Escobar's momentum didn't seem to dampen in the slightest due to this. Escobar's palm flipped over, causing a spear to appear. In that moment, his momentum completely changed as wild energies began to flow around him. Harsh winter winds. Fragrant spring air. Blazing summer heat. Cool fall breezes. Beneath this presence, the pressure the other guards felt alleviated by more than 80%. Though their movements were still somewhat hindered, it most definitely wasn't as exaggerated as it had been before. In the distance, Hargrove's pupils constricted into pinholes. Impossible. Hold. Escobar's voice boomed when the other guards wanted to take action. He looked toward Lionel seriously, the latter having seemingly not reacted to the sudden change. Your mother is dead. What do you plan to do with this information? Chapter 525. Lionel didn't say a thing for a long while. He continued to look at the ground, his arms strapped around his body beneath his straitjacket. For a moment, it seemed as though he hadn't heard a single word that was spoken. However, a bloodthirsty aura was slowly forming around him. Lionel's head tilted upward. Through the strands of his hair, one could finally just barely make out one of his eyes. It was a vacant pale green that seemed to stare at nothing and everything at the same time. The faint illusion of blood-red wings spread to Lionel's back, the distorted image of a demon hanging around him. In just a few moments, those red wings formed into the image of a female angel. Her red wings wrapped around Lionel, her arms holding onto him tightly. It was just an illusion, but it seemed oh so real. Tears of blood began to uncontrollably fall from the eyes of those around Lionel. With the exception of Escobar, they all seemed to be affected by the change. I see. Since she's dead, what reason do you have to keep living? Under the astonished gazes of many, thousands of dark cloud prison guards suddenly turned their weapons onto themselves. Bang! The sounds of several gunshots rang at once. But, from afar, it sounded like just a single gun had been fired. The actions were so smooth and in sync that even the pulling of so many triggers seemed to come from a single point. Escobar's gaze widened before gaining a tinge of red. In that moment, just as Lionel's words descended, he suddenly felt an overwhelming will to spear his skull through. If he hadn't bit his tongue, he really might have gone through with it. His heart trembled. Just what kind of maddening ability was this? The bloody angel hanging around Lionel only seemed to grow more corporeal as though being fed by the deaths of those around her. Her visage became clearer, a doting expression on her face as she lightly stroked Lionel's hair. No matter how one looked at her, it seemed like she was a proud mother. Or rather, she would have been had it not been for the fact her eye sockets were filled with nothing but an endless void. The sound of collapsing bodies filled the quiet air. In an instant, over half of a 10,000-man army fell into a pool of their own blood, their weapons painted with their own life. The scene was absolutely horrid and a metallic stench soon filled the air. Escobar's grip on his spear tightened. He could still see Lionel's singular eye through the strands of his hair, looking at him curiously as though he was wondering why it was he hadn't died when he told him to. As for the other, it seemed to stay hidden behind a veil of darkness, lurking. The Governor Duke could no longer hold back. He felt like this child had been wronged, so he gave him a chance and spoke the truth. However, he had never expected for his moment of soft-heartedness to cost him half of his men in a single breath. There was a limit to his understanding, to his sympathy. This was no longer the baby in those photos, this was a monster. A monster he had to kill. Die. Escobar's spear seemed to encompass the world. Its point became the origin and its shaft became purpose. In the blink of an eye, the spear tip appeared before Lionel's brow. With just a half a foot more, the skull of this young man would be pierced through. However, would things really be so easy? A mirror suddenly manifested before Lionel. Escobar's spear tip hardly touched its surface before it was reflected back. The warden was sent flying, his spear-wielding arm splintering in two. The horrid imagery of a forearm being split in half down its length etched itself into the hearts of all those who saw it. Within Lionel's group, a young woman with disheveled hair bit at her fingernails to the point they bled. But, even then, she didn't seem intent on stopping. She looked toward Escobar warily as though she was the one who should fear him rather than the other way around. It was as though she was completely oblivious to how powerful she was. Lionel stood in place indifferently. It was as though he couldn't tell that his life had been on the line. Or, maybe, it hadn't ever truly been. Escobar's face became a deathly pale. He looked toward his arm incredulously, unable to believe what had just happened. He hadn't awakened a powerful ability. In fact, it was of the mere C-grade upon awakening. However, he had never cared much because his spear arts could more than make up for this. With the time he had spent with Lionel's father, it was doubtful that there was anyone on earth who could match his comprehension of the spear. So, how had he suffered so greatly just now? It was at that moment that there was a sudden change to the battlefield. Lionel and Aina led a charge out of the forest edge that surrounded Dark Cloud Prison. It had taken them several hours, but they had finally cleared out all the scouts and carved a path here. And, luckily, they had managed to avoid any casualties in huge thanks to Lionel's leadership abilities. However, what they saw after they reached the clearing of flat lands astounded them. A city fallen from the skies, a group of prisoners frozen in their attempt to climb its walls, and, over 5,000 dead guards, lying in a pool of their own blood. The sight was horrid, but what left Lionel the most stunned was the appearance of a particular man. Despite the distance of over 200 kilometers that separated them, with Lionel's senses, Escobar might as well have been inches from his face. Coach. Lionel's expression flickered with confusion. What was Coach Owen doing here? No matter how long passed, Lionel would never mistake that rat of a mustache for anyone else. Seeing the state of Coach Owen's arm, Lionel's anger suddenly flared. If there were two people he had to pick as the duo he respected the most in his life, the first would be his father, and the second would be this man right before him. In that moment, the battlefield suddenly gained a second bloodthirsty aura, one that seemed to rival Lionel's without the slightest hint of losing out. However, it was then that something completely unexpected happened. Lionel looked toward the new arrivals with curiosity. But, when his gaze landed on Lionel, he was shocked. You look exactly like me." Lionel's head finally raised all the way, both of his eyes and his face finally becoming clear. However, when Lionel saw this face, his brows furrowed. This wasn't because Lionel looked like him, but because of the exact opposite. They, quite honestly, looked nothing alike. What the hell was this person talking about? Chapter 526. Lionel's face was exceptionally pale. One couldn't call him either handsome or ugly, but simply average. Though, it was a bit difficult to tell if this was the best he could do, or if it was simply because he was malnourished. With how sunken his cheeks were, it was clear that he had never had enough to eat. So, though he looked quite plain now, he may very well look different if he finally began to receive enough sustenance. However, this wasn't the reason Lionel felt he looked nothing like him. The truth was that with Lionel's senses, it was quite easy for him to fill in Lionel's features and extrapolate how the latter would look. But, even then, they were nothing alike. Lionel's jaw wasn't as sharp as his own, his cheeks weren't as high, and his nose was far more prominent and pointed. In addition, Lionel was only just about 2 meters tall now, or 66. He had grown a few inches since his last day at Royal Blue Academy. But, Lionel could tell that if Lionel stood straight, the latter would be over 7 feet tall, a full head taller than Lionel. Whether Lionel and Lionel looked the same was hardly relevant on any other day. But, when the first words out of Lionel's mouth was that they were identical, it left Lionel at a loss. Just what was that supposed to mean? The truth of the matter was that other than the color of their eyes and the fact Lionel had the same messy, dirty blonde hair Lionel once had before he activated his metal synergy lineage factor. They were quite literally nothing alike. And, as though to drive this point further, Lionel kept getting an uneasy feeling from the vacancy in Lionel's gaze. Lionel sounded so cheerful and his words even seemed to carry the hint of being pleasantly surprised, all while his gaze remained as deadpan as could be. This reality only made Lionel feel more uneasy. "Stay alert," Lionel said softly. His words were only heard by those to his back. Lionel continued to observe Lionel curiously, a faint excitement that never reached his eyes dancing across his expression. "Are we related? Are you my brother perhaps? A cousin who happens to look a lot like me? Are we? Sorry, I forget the word. I think it starts with AT. Tweens maybe? Twines? Forget it. My mother, do you know her?" Lionel's frown deepened. His social awareness is severely lacking. His expressions all seem to be slightly off. The only way he'd think we look the same is if he had never seen himself in a mirror before. But, even then, why would that be the conclusion he jumped to? Even if he had never seen himself in a mirror before, where would he get the thought that I was who he looked like? Where would he have seen me before? The more Lionel thought, the more he came to understand that Dark Cloud Prison wasn't as simple as he originally thought. The only obvious conclusion he could make was that these men and women before him were actually prisoners. That much was obvious. After all, they all wore the same garbs, so this wasn't a hard conclusion to come to. What was more damning was the fact that these prisoners acted as though they had never seen the light of day. Lionel shook his head. It seemed he was too naive. There was no way that the Empire prison would be as perfect as they tried to make it seem to be. "He's dangerous," Ana's voice drifted to Lionel's ears. Lionel nodded seriously, his fists clenching. In the distance, when Governor Duke Owen realized that it was Lionel who had appeared, his gaze flashed with a complicated light. He almost forgot about the horrible pain shaking his body. However, Lionel no longer had the mind to pay to his coach Owen. It wasn't because he didn't care about his life. In fact, there was no other person here who he cared more about with the exception of Ana. But, he had to take action now. There was something odd about the atmosphere. It should have been a battle between Hargrove City and Dark Cloud Prison. But, somehow, this group, led by Lionel, had interfered and become the main enemy. Lionel also felt like if he moved forward any further, a strong spatial lock would collapse around him. At the moment, it had been weakened considerably due to what seemed like Escobar's domain of universal force. But, considering the state of his coach at the moment, how much longer could he really hold out? Lionel blinked, feeling somewhat disappointed. "Why won't you answer me?" In response, Lionel flipped over a palm, a pitch-black spear appearing in his hand. The little mink seemed to awaken atop his head, the little guy's gaze locked onto the group before them. "Maybe I didn't give you enough information?" Lionel wondered aloud to himself. "My name is Lionel Morales. As for my mother's name, I'm not sure. Do we share a family name?" Lionel froze. What the hell? Ana's brows furrowed in confusion as well. Was there really such a coincidence in the world? Believing that someone shared the same name as Lionel wasn't too surprising. Before the metamorphosis, Earth's population was counted in the tens of billions, approaching 100 billion. Back then, there were no shortage of people who shared not only the same first name, but even the same last name, and there were even more people who shared the same name pronunciation but differed in the spelling. However, what made this instance particularly shocking was the fact that Lionel's first words had been that he and Lionel looked identical. Could there be such a coincidence in this world? Confusion colored Lionel's features. He had just steeled himself to attack, but now he questioned himself. Was this a practical joke? But why did it not seem like one? What was going on here exactly? Chapter 527. Could it be a mind-reading ability? Ana communicated secretly with Lionel. Lionel gazed toward the fading blood angel to Lionel's back. After a moment, he steeled himself. Nika. Yes, Captain. A young girl called out to Lionel's back. Reconstruct the scene. Send the images to me. Don't hold back. Yes. Nika worked quickly. She was one of the few sensory types among Lionel's troop, but her ability was unique. She was able to reconstruct the cause and effect of a location, essentially simulating the past events of a place for up to 1 month. She could also transmit these images and deductions to another person. At her ability's current stage of evolution, it had limited usage in battle. But, when it came to reconnaissance, she was second to none. When Lionel felt Nika's dream force penetrate toward him, he didn't resist. Usually, Nika wouldn't dare to do this with anyone else. Those with dream force affinity were incredibly rare, and it would be too easy for one to get lost in the events she displayed. However, Lionel was different. When Lionel opened his eyes once again, he had a grasp of the entire situation, even down to the abilities Lionel's group had displayed. Leave this, Lionel, to me. Lionel said plainly, his gaze suddenly becoming cold and indifferent. Stay within my domain and do not leave, or else I can't guarantee your safety. After seeing the past events, Lionel understood Lionel's ability. Such a person was too dangerous. He would defeat him first, then ask questions later. Clang. 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 A black domain filled with illusory chains surged into existence around Lionel, covering a radius of just over 20 meters in every direction. Lionel immediately realized that this was his limit. He couldn't extend his domain any further without sapping his stamina faster than he could get returns on. But, this size was just enough. Brandishing his spear, Lionel pointed it toward Lionel, his aura stifling. Those around Lionel immediately realized that Lionel was giving off a different feeling compared to the others. On the Hargrove city walls, many were still frozen in place due to Vice's ability. Whether it was the raising and lowering of the platforms, the archers, or even Salnas himself, no one seemed capable of moving. But, truthfully, though they feared Vice somewhat, they were more than willing to see the talents of Earth at each other's throats in this way. Anared's gaze narrowed as he locked onto Lionel in the distance. But, the latter hadn't even spared the city a glance after the first look. It was as though he couldn't be bothered to care about it. Inwardly, Anared was a bit shocked. He knew how many scouts they had deployed. How had a 250-man squad managed to come this far without a single one sending word back? The truth was that Anared had already gotten reports from the north of the continent, and there was currently a major battle going on over there. However, he didn't care to go and oversee those matters personally because taking in these prisoners was far more important to Terrain's overall plan. As long as Noah was stalled, that would be far more than enough. Initially, when Anared didn't hear back from the south, he had thought that meant Earth only sent one squad. After all, according to their intelligence, Noah was the only acting commander of this troop of Earth's talents. What he didn't expect, though, was for Lionel to have carved a path out of the south for himself. Dealing with a savant won't be so easy, yet you've chosen to antagonize such a large group of them on your own. You've signed your own death certificate. Anared thought coldly. At this moment, even he could hardly move. Though he had his trump cards to do so just like Coach Owen had, he didn't care to activate them just yet. Right now, he was content to lay back and watch. However, Anared's expression when he observed the dome around Lionel couldn't help but turn serious. He didn't know what it was, but for some reason it left him feeling uneasy. He couldn't help but wonder if this was Lionel's ability. When Lionel saw Lionel point a spear toward him, his voice trailed off, the excitement it once had fading. He couldn't seem to wrap his mind around why someone who had such a high chance of being his brother would treat him like this. Lionel, don't. Coach Owen mustered all the strength he had left to shout out this warning. Just run. This isn't your fight. Lionel paused, sending a glance toward his coach. Hey, coach. Lionel suddenly grinned. Let's make a deal, all right? No. Coach Owen said firmly. Hey. You haven't even heard what I wanted to say just yet. Are you that protective of that dead rat you call a mustache? Kid. The surviving guards of Dark Cloud Prison were stunned, especially Escobar's right-hand man, Garwin. None of them had ever seen anyone treat their Governor Duke like this. Lionel laughed. Just sit tight, old man. As long as I survive, though, you have to promise to shave that sad excuse for facial hair off. Lionel's air of confidence hung over the battlefield, completely overshadowing Lionel's bloodthirsty aura. The stark difference between the two men was apparent at a single glance. Just looking at Lionel's back and feeling the security of his domain made the youths following feel a second wind hit their sails. They had just fought a bloody battle over the course of several hours, how could they not feel tired? But now, they felt as though they could battle for several hours more. PCHU. The sudden sound caught everyone off guard. In such an atmosphere, it was the last sound one expected to hear. It was the kind of change that left everyone dazed. Coach Owen looked down, only to find a bloody hole in his gut. Blood overflowed so densely that it almost looked like a waterfall of black, fusing into his dark military garb without a sense of how precious it was. With a splutter, blood leaked out from Coach Owen's lips, running over his chin and down his neck. He felt his life quickly draining from him. Lionel looked toward Coach Owen, a slight light illuminating his eye for the first time. But, this light held no humanity. Rather, it held nothing but madness. You called him Lionel. Why did you call him Lionel? Why did you call him Lionel? Important note below January 6, 22. Chapter 528. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Lionel had never expected for such a thing to happen. After being blown away by a mysterious mirror ability, his coach Owen had flown back more than 100 meters from Lionel. The distance that separated them couldn't be considered to be small. By any logic, it shouldn't have been possible to attack the Governor Duke without giving Lionel time to respond. But, the facts were laid out before them all. Coach Owen's own spear shot through his belly, his blood painting its shaft crimson. With a cough, Escobar slumped backward, his breathing growing incredibly shallow. Ana's eyes widened. But in the next instant, her gaze snapped toward Lionel, flashes of worry lighting her irises. Unfortunately, it was already too late for her to say anything. Whatever light Lionel's aura held vanished, being washed by an oppressive might that made those in his presence feel as though a hand was descending from the skies. Tell me. Why did you call him that? Clang. 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 Lionel took a step forward, the ground beneath his feet groaning and whining. The image of a majestic bird appeared to his back. It had beautiful feathers of gold and white, eyes filled with endless wisdom and a wingspan that seemed capable of encompassing the world. Lionel's next step seemed to blur, touching the ground both so lightly and with such speed that it left nothing but an after-image in its wake. It wasn't until Lionel was already over 100 meters away from the place of its descent that the concrete suddenly folded beneath the pressure. Ana's expression changed, her head snapping back toward everyone else. Support him. Her voice held no less compulsion than Lionel's. It became quite clear quite quickly that the reason she didn't lead wasn't because she couldn't, but rather because she chose to defer to Lionel. But at this moment, there wasn't time for that. Anared looked at this change with a curious light in his eye. In truth, the only two that had a chance at shaking his position were Lionel and Ana. Since they had so graciously shown themselves. The sword that hovered to Anared's back suddenly vibrated, resonating with a sudden will to battle. As though a road of air manifested before him, Anared casually stepped off the top of Hargrove City's walls. His body seemed to resemble a sword streaking across the skies. He sliced the wind in two, intercepting Ana and the others before they could even think of supporting Lionel. At that moment, Anared felt monstrous killing intent lock onto him. Even his heart skipped a single beat before his sword force reaffirmed his resolve in the next moment. He couldn't help but frown. Nothing had shaken his heart so severely in decades. Just what was that? Leave him to me. The voice came from Anared's front, but it was clearly not aimed toward him. It took him just a moment to realize that it had actually been Aina's words for Lionel. Anared couldn't help but internally sneer. Did this girl think that he was Julnia? He could defeat someone on that level without even unsheathing his sword. Yet, Aina would have likely lost her life had it not been for Lionel's intervention. However, Aina didn't pull out her great sword as Anared had expected. In fact, she tossed it to the ground as though it was worthless, reaching to the large curved package on her back. With a thought, a massive golden red axe appeared in her hand. Her aura completely changed, reaching a level of oppression that made Anared's indifferent expression frown. For Season's realm. If that was all, maybe Anared could accept it. But, the axe in Aina's hand was also on the cusp of entering the fifth dimension. Let alone the fact Anared had hardly seen a quasi-bronze treasure in his life, even among those he had, this was the most powerful. A violent red aura surged around Aina, a slight hint of blood wrinkling the noses of those in its presence. Veins popped up across the delicate hand she used to clench her battle ax's handle. The axe trembled with excitement, a thirst for reaping life humming its shining edges. Aina was pissed. Anared actually chose this moment to step forward when all she wanted to do was support Lionel. Even as her fighting spirit reached its peak, her eyes gave the sign of several warnings. She swore that if anything happened to Lionel, Anared and the whole of Terrain would follow him to the grave. Lionel's own emotions reached a peak as well. To this point, he hadn't hated anyone of Terrain. He felt as though they were simply doing what was best for their futures. This was the way of the world. Though he, of course, wanted to protect his world from invaders, he had never reached a point of doing it out of hatred. However, now things were different. Not only had their actions put the life of his coach on the line, but now they were even targeting Aina. If Terrain wanted his fury so badly, they could have it. Lionel appeared between his coach and Lionel, his aura towering. The shocked guards of Dark Cloud Prison suddenly felt as though an immovable pillar stood before them all. Even if the sky collapsed, it would be there to catch it. Lionel's expression became livid. Not only had this warden not answered his question, now someone else had come to block his way. No. Coach Owen mumbled weakly, trying one last time to force Lionel to run. Just die. Lionel roared. The bloody angel to Lionel's back contrasted the golden owl to Lionel's. It felt as though a clash of ages had suddenly erupted. Lionel's hair blew back, but his cold, calculating gaze remained indifferent. He observed Lionel's hysteria without a hint of emotion, his eyes seemingly even more vacant than the latter's. The likes of you couldn't possibly hope to take control of my mind. Lionel said coldly. Bind. Lionel pointed his spear forward. With a thought, chains surged, wrapping around Lionel's body in layer after layer. The dark prisoners to Lionel's back panicked. It was clear they didn't have much fighting experience, but how could they? This was the first time they had been in the outside world since they were toddlers. It was a miracle they even knew how to walk, let alone fight. This alone was a testament to just how fearsome savants were. It had been less than a few hours since this group even realized they had abilities at all, yet they were already so powerful. What would happen if they had time acclimate and grow? Would Lionel even be worthy of standing in their presence? It was difficult to tell. However, they were completely lost without Lionel's guidance. Just when Lionel planned to squeeze Lionel to death in a fit of rage, he heard muffled, irrational rambling. It's nothing but a dream, this nothing but fantasy, go away. Lionel didn't have time to sneer even if he wanted to. Before his very eyes, his chain domain, arguably his most powerful ability, began to crumble piece by piece. It wisped away like smoke in the wind, dissipating as though it really was nothing but an illusion, a fantasy, a dream. Kill him. Kill him. Kill him. Lionel roared into the skies, red tainting his vision. The space around the madman began to collapse. No, it was worse than collapsing. It was as though every bit and piece of matter was slowly being erased. A pit appeared below and above him as thought the whole world was losing its color. Vacant darkness expanded rapidly, leaving Lionel's figure and his screams as the only tangible existences that remained. Lionel's jaw clenched, finally realizing the kind of monster he was dealing with. Lionel's ability was built upon dream force, but his use of it was beyond anything Lionel could imagine. Lionel's ability was strictly internal. Even after he replaced his soul force with dream force, he was unable to turn it against his enemies and force them into an illusion the like dream abode had been able to. But, in return for this, his computational abilities were far beyond what even a machine could match, let alone what a human could do. However, Lionel was the exact opposite. Though he could somewhat use his dream force to boost his computational ability, it was nowhere near the level Lionel could. But, in return, he was able to manifest his consciousness into the world, playing with the fabric of reality as he pleased. If he wanted you to die, you would die. If he wanted you to stab yourself with your own spear, you would do so. If he wanted to erase you from existence, he could. Lionel was a monster, masquerading in the body of a frail youth who wanted to see his mother again. This realization woke Lionel from a dream he felt like he had been in from the very beginning. This world was nothing like the one he had come to know. In this world, a fairy tale like the stories of Arthur Pendragon could become real. In this world, a madman with strength could destroy everything. Chapter 529. Lionel closed his eyes. For a moment, everything else in the world seemed to vanish. His breathing grew steady and his heart stilled, even his mind, used to running at impossible speeds, slowed. After a moment, even his thoughts became vacant. In such a moment, what one should have been feeling was fear. Seeing such a monster before you, a man who was gifted with talent that others couldn't even hope to grasp, what choice was there other than to despair? However, this wasn't the reality Lionel saw before him. Rather, he saw a path that had suddenly lit a fire, blazing a trail that he hadn't noticed before. It was as though he had always been following the wrong path, completely oblivious to the right one that had always been in arm's reach. In the outside world, everyone else could only see Lionel's domain rapidly deteriorating. Lionel himself stood, completely unmoving. To his back, what remained of a once 10,000-strong army shook beneath Lionel's presence. The only thing that separated them and such a monster was a seemingly frail teenage boy who was at the end of his rope. Lionel's domain was directly tied to his ethereal glabella and his mind. Every piece of it that faded took another piece of him. Even though Lionel didn't seem capable of taking direct action against Lionel with how strong the latter's dream force affinity was, this alone was enough to severely weaken Lionel. As chain after chain disintegrated, Lionel's mind faltered and weakened. He should have been under an excruciating amount of pain, the kind of horrible, spine-tearing torture that could obliterate one's resolve. Yet, Lionel stood, completely unmoving. In the distance, Aina grew more panicked. She didn't have a detailed understanding of what was happening, but all she needed to see was the fact that the world around Lionel was crumbling. Though she had managed to hold Anared back long enough for the remaining 200+ young warriors to curl around them, before they could even manage to get into range to do anything, one of the savants blocked their path, scratching at his rat's nest-like hair. The good news was the Lionel's rampage had interfered with Vice's ability as well, allowing them to move even without the protection of Lionel's domain. But the bad news was that this unkempt man who the others called Monkey suddenly multiplied in number. In one moment, there was just one of him. In the next instant, there was 2, then 4, then 8. In the blink of an eye, over 1,000 of him blocked the path forward, causing the troop of youths to come to a grinding halt, serious expressions on their faces. It suddenly became obvious why it was no one could tell the exact number of people Lionel had brought with him. Stay in your squads. Don't underestimate him. Niall took command of the situation, his gaze flashing with a hint of worry. Things were quickly getting out of hand. These savants had completely lost their minds. In fact, this monkey individual hadn't even blocked their path at Lionel's order. Niall could see the look in his eye quite clearly, it was boredom. He blocked them simply because he was bored of standing around. Such an enemy, without logical goals or comprehensible aspirations, they were the most fear-inducing. Niall grit his teeth, sending a look toward Lionel. It seemed as though a struggle was unfurling. On one side, there was the enraged Lionel trying to erase everything that was Lionel. And, on the other side, there was the silent Lionel trying to protect his life. It was simply impossible to see it any other way. Niall gripped onto his spear. He didn't know what he could do to help even if he made it through, but he knew he wanted to make it no matter what. He flexed the pole arm between his hands, letting the light of the setting sun reflect across the blade. He shot forward into the crowd of clones, his will steeled. Unfortunately, there were many things a strong will couldn't overcome. As quickly as he came flying forward, Niall shot back. If it wasn't for the 2 squads of 10 he led coming together to stop his flight backward, it was hard to tell just how far he would have gone. Niall's arms trembled. Though he tried to hold it back, in the next instant, he coughed violently, a mouthful of blood flying from his lips. Niall looked up, allowing his squads to help him stand. Not more than 10 meters away, the clone he had clashed with stood in a bloody mess, its head peeled open like a grotesque blooming flower of flesh and bone. What shocked Niall wasn't the fact this had happened, but rather the cause of it. In the moment, the clone had head-butted the point of his spear. However, what Niall couldn't understand was why the clones were that strong. Most of those with cloning abilities he had come across had strong limitations. Most of the time, the limitation came in number of clones or the strength of them. But somehow, Monkey didn't seem restricted by either. What Niall didn't know was that Monkey's ability wasn't a cloning ability. Monkey had the ability to double almost anything. As for the limitations of his ability, it was hard to tell. But, if Niall was aware of this, he would understand why it was he was sent flying back so easily. If Monkey could double himself 10 times and form over 1,000 clones, what would happen if he did the same with his strength? In fact, if it wasn't for the fact Monkey's flesh and blood was so frail, he would be able to exhibit far more of this strength before his body collapsed. In that case, let alone just getting flung back, Niall might have died in a single strike. If Monkey was smarter and doubled the toughness of his skin and bone, or even if he just had a weapon, his level of strength would be impossible to fathom. A grim expression took hold of Niall's visage. Even as Monkey's clone collapsed, dead, his heart didn't calm in the slightest. Looking at the over 1,000 that remained, let alone making it through to Lionel, he wondered if it would even be possible to survive. When Niall saw the somewhat curious gazes of the savants that remained, his heart plunged into despair. He couldn't understand why these people were gifted with so much strength. And, all the while, their leader was losing his mind and roaring into the skies, but they didn't even seem to notice in the slightest. When Aina saw Niall get repelled so easily, her heart constricted. Any hopes she had of Niall, Nika, and the others making it to Lionel before Lionel could harm him seemed to disappear. Out of habit, Aina began to bite at her lips again, her anxiousness growing. At the same time, she felt a belly full of rage every time her battle axe crossed paths with Anared's sword. Even though she was just a margin weaker, the ferocity of her attacks only seemed to grow. Her every strike carried the intention to kill, her heart nearly bursting out from her ribcage under the exertion. She didn't care about the stamina consumption. Every time she swung, she seemed to carry the weight of the world behind her. The clashes caused the surrounding air to explode, the temperature incrementally rising simply due to the heat coming off their blades. Still, even as she pressed so hard, she knew it was impossible to make it in time. By now, Lionel's erasure had almost reached Lionel. What remained of his chain domain seemed to be on its last legs, dispersing into minute particles before vanishing into nothingness. Aina's teeth drew blood from her lips, her anxiousness hidden beneath her mask. "Come on, set faster, set faster." Aina anxiously looked toward the sun. But, its descent seemed to be ever so slow. By the time night came around, it would be too late. Anared continued to indifferently parry Aina's strikes. It wasn't that he didn't want to defeat her right here and now, but even he found it difficult to do so. There was no need for him to go all out. At this pace, she would simply tire herself out. By then, defeating her will be as easy as a single sweep of the sword. Aina sent another panicked look toward Lionel, narrowly avoiding another sword strike. No! Aina's infuriated shout resonated through the battlefield. For a moment, a fear that was deeply hidden within all their souls seemed to surface. Even the savants paused in their actions. With their inability to control themselves, the shock and horror was clearly painted on their faces. Even as savants, they held none of the air true experts should have. Anared's sword faltered, causing his fluid style to be interrupted. Without a choice, he could only retreat to avoid being bisected, a frown taking over his usually indifferent expression. Coach Owen closed his eyes, an aching pain far greater than the stab wound through his gut taking hold. At that moment, Lionel's domain of nothingness seemed to have reached Lionel. By all rights, it should have swallowed him whole. Even Lionel's madness gave way to a slight excitement as though he wanted nothing more than for Lionel to disappear. However, Lionel's body remained completely unscathed. His body stood in the void of nothingness, completely indifferent, a serene expression on his face. And then, his eyes finally opened. When they did, the skies overturned, the darkening clouds of dusk dispersing and the raging winds of the battlefield slowing to a crawl. Chapter 530. Lionel's aura was like a raging tiger released from its chains. It commanded absolute respect within its territory. Chain domain. Clang. 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 The instant the words left Lionel's lips, the crumbling domain around him suddenly resurrected, coming back in full force. No, to say full force would be to assume that it came back just as strong. But the reality was very much different. In the past, the chains were illusory and their rattling rang hollow. But now, it looked as though real chains had manifested into the air, their bodies exuding a black fog that suffocated their surroundings. However, just when it felt as though just these changes were shocking enough, the domain began to change again. Royal Blue Province was a tropical location that experienced summer almost all year round. It never seemed to get too blistering hot and it never snowed. It could be said that the spring and summer should have been the seasons Lionel was the most familiar with. Still, even to this point, Lionel had failed to comprehend the four seasons realm on his own. The reason was simple: he found it difficult to wrap his mind around the concept of the seasons suddenly becoming a battle technique. Even if he knew it was possible, his mind couldn't cross an artificial barrier it put up for itself. Even after experiencing the same seasons every day for all his life, Lionel couldn't cross the final step. How was he supposed to translate such gentle climate into a battle technique? It simply didn't make any sense. For that matter, how could someone with fire elemental force ever hope to grasp the cold of winter? Or how could someone with ice elemental force ever hope to grasp summer? Lionel didn't know how long he would spend stuck at this barrier. However, what he never would have expected was for Lionel to break it for him. To say that Lionel helped Lionel grasp the four seasons realm was incorrect. Rather, Lionel taught Lionel the way he should look at this world. Lionel was often bound by logic. He felt that everything should have a natural progression and that the world should have cause and effect. In fact, even now, he still believed this. Lionel felt that there was no issue with his beliefs. Rather, there was an issue in the method by which he implemented them. In order to understand cause and effect, one had to first grasp the rules of a system. Trying to understand what was going on in a sports game without first grasping the rules would only leave you lost. To this point, Lionel was still using the rules of modern Earth. In that world, such fanciful abilities couldn't be reality. Science was the ruler, and something like a fairy tale character coming to life was nothing more than a joke. These thoughts not only fueled him, but they restrained him, bogging down his mind and limiting his thoughts. Simply put, it was foolish. But now, things were different. Lionel thought that the only seasons he was familiar with were spring and summer. As for winters and falls, though he had experienced them when traveling to other provinces, his understanding of them could be considered to be minimal. But was that really true? If Lionel was as logical as he claimed to be, had realized that seasons were decided by the tilt of Earth and its location around the sun. A season wasn't restricted by temperature, it was simply a cycle of time. Lionel was so bogged down by his own preconceptions that he didn't even manage to remember such a simple concept. The reality was that Lionel had experienced winter once a year, every year, for his whole life. Just because it didn't get bone-chillingly cold, didn't mean he hadn't. What did this mean? It meant that the seasons were about more than just surface-level conceptions. Temperature was irrelevant, climate was irrelevant, even the beautiful gradient of colors the seasons shifted between were irrelevant. In that case, what were the seasons? Everyone experienced them differently. In fact, even if one shared the same planet, if you were located in different hemispheres, the cycles wouldn't even be the same. So what was a season? What was the four seasons realm? Wasn't it just a journey around the sun? To the current Lionel, it wasn't even this. To him, the four seasons simply represented a cycle, an infinite loop dependent on countless factors. If he tweaked these factors as he pleased, he could make what he wanted out of the four seasons realm. On a large scale, the cycle encompassed an entire planet, its orbit, its tilt and its people. On a small scale, all it took was one's own domain. The moment Lionel grasped this, his aura completely changed. The amount of universal force around him skyrocketed, reaching levels that dwarfed even the savants. When Lionel unleashed the shackles on his mind, what he had done wasn't as simple as understanding the four seasons realm for a particular weapon or a particular force-strengthening deviation. Rather, he embodied the four seasons realm. Everything within his domain was under his control. If Uncle Montez had been here, he would have laughed uproariously. It would have been the kind of laughter that shook the skies and forced the earth to quake. This was the true four seasons realm. Only by grasping it could domains display their true strength. The four seasons realm. The domain realm. The realm of kings. Bind. Lionel's voice came down like a command from on high. The chains of his chain domain roared like flood dragons, surging into Lionel's space of nothingness as though mythical creatures snaking through the skies. At that moment, Lionel's expression finally changed. Fear replaced the light of madness in his gaze as he retreated. The earth folded to Lionel's will, the laws of reality bending and twisting. In one instant he was in front of the savants, and in the next he was standing behind them, his expression trembling. Kill him. Lionel's voice shivered, a trembling cadence clear within. The instant he felt like he no longer held the upper hand, his air of confidence crumbled. He held none of the resolve a man should have. Hearing Lionel's command, even Monkey was forced to turn back, giving the youth warriors some reprieve. Stay back. Lionel commanded. Leave them all to me. Go and support Aina. I don't want to see Anared strutting around here any longer. Lionel's pupils flickered with a violet-red light, his aura growing heavier with each passing moment. The youths hesitated. By now, they were beaten and bloodied, many of them were even on their last legs. But, it was precisely because of this that they couldn't fathom the idea of Lionel going against them all alone. However, when Lionel looked back toward them, the look in his eye made them shiver. It felt as though a higher being was gazing upon them. The bronze runes that flickered into and out of existence, all of Lionel's body radiated a palpable pressure. Even the space around him seemed to twist and bend. Nile and the others gulped. They felt like even if they wanted to, it would have been impossible to disobey Lionel's orders. Yes, Captain. Before the youths realized what they were doing, they had already saluted and turned back, charging toward the battle between Aina and Anared. Anared frowned. He didn't know what a domain was to begin with. So, he understood even less about the changes Lionel had undergone. Regardless, facing even one savant is suicide, let alone four. Anared retrieved his sword, retreating with light steps. Since you want to despair, I'll let you despair. Now that Vice had completely focused his abilities in Lionel's direction, those around Hargrove City had finally been released. It seemed that these fools had forgotten this was a war. However, just as he was sneering, Anared felt a cold shiver down his spine. He instinctively looked in a certain direction only to see Lionel's cold gaze locked onto him. A deep fear suddenly took root in his heart. Before, Lionel's complete indifference had left him feeling uncomfortable. But this sudden attention made him feel as though a reaper had grasped onto his throat. The look had a clear meaning. Even if you ran to the ends of the earth, you would still die. Aina's shout had engraved itself onto Lionel's heart. If Anared thought he could get away with it, he was sorely mistaken. Lionel turned his attention back to the savants before him. Monkey's thousands of clones, Candle's mysterious mirrors, Vice's spatial locks. Lionel's reality warping. Even just a single one of these savants would be enough to bring a world to its knees. Yet, with its talent, Earth had birthed 4 in just a single generation, and Lionel was crazy enough to face them all alone. The several hundred clones Monkey had remaining swarmed Lionel and suddenly doubled once again. The sight was truly one to behold. A single man facing an army of monsters. Lionel indifferently swept a gaze through them, his spear tip just barely grazing the cracked, concrete grounds. Piss off. In that moment, countless chains wrapped around Monkey's clones. Under the astonished gazes of those watching, hundreds of clones shattered into a rain of flesh, blood and bones, painting Lionel's chain domain in a dripping crimson. Chapter 531. Aina felt as though a massive weight had suddenly been taken off her shoulders. Seeing Lionel standing straight and tall, a rain of blood falling around him, a smile couldn't help but bloom beneath her mask. If others could have seen it, it would have been the kind of smile that warmed the heart regardless of her scars. Other women, when witnessing such carnage, would feel their intestines twist and their stomachs overturn. But, to Aina, it couldn't have been a more beautiful sight at that moment. Lionel shot forward, the chains of his spears dancing as though the singing chimes of a bell. Their elation shot through the battlefield, their bodies intertwining and blotting out the skies above. Lionel's speed seemed to touch a new level. His body was completely wrapped in universal force, making his actions breathe with an air of confidence that couldn't be denied. Seeing his clones destroyed, Monkey quickly moved to form new ones, but by this point, Lionel had already appeared before his main body, the indifference in his gaze making the latter shiver. Concepts of life and death weren't things the savants quite understood. Their understanding of the world was too shallow, and unlike other children, they never learned about these matters. Keeping them naive was the best way to nerf their abilities. However, even with this being the case, a fear of death was an instinct ingrained in our very beings. The cold look in Lionel's eye. The sparkling tip of his black spear. The looming aura that seemed to want to suffocate him down to his final breath. Monkey felt as though the thing he should fear most had appeared before him. At that moment, Candle finally reacted, forming a large mirror that blocked Lionel's path forward. At the same time, veins popped up across Vice's forehead, his entire being focusing on Lionel. The space around Lionel constricted and warped. A single step that would have once shot him forward 10 meters shrunk down to 5, then 2, then 1. This is my domain. Not yours. Lionel spoke indifferently. Lionel's body suddenly blurred, leaving several afterimages in his wake. He shot through a gap in Candle's mirrors, the bronze runes dancing across his body finally coming into full effect. A heavy domain of gravity manifested around Lionel, trying to force the weak-bodied savants to their knees. Vice, Lionel and Monkey reacted quickly, each countering via their own methods. Vice weakened the space around him, Monkey strengthened the muscles in his legs, and Lionel's dream force surged, weakening the gravity around him. However, Candle had no counter. She fell to the ground, nervously biting at her nails with even more fervor. Seeing the fear in her eyes, Lionel's cold indifference didn't waver. Bind. Candle suddenly found herself wrapped in chains from head to toe, a gaseous blackness wafting around her body. Candle's scream shook the hearts of all those who heard it. Not because it was fear-inducing, but rather because she sounded no different from any other scared teenage girl. The horror she felt was palpable. A strong repulsion slammed against Lionel's chains, causing the cocoon Candle had been wrapped in to bulge and buckle. Lionel shot by as though he didn't notice the oddity. But the slight paling of his expression told a different story entirely. After grasping the Four Seasons realm, Lionel felt as though the burden he once experienced when using his domain had vanished. Whereas in the past a few minutes was an issue, at this current point, even holding on for an hour shouldn't have been a problem. However, that would only hold true if all things remained equal. With such powerful opponents clashing against him, the stamina consumption he experienced was several levels higher than usual. In fact, if not for comprehending the Four Seasons realm, his domain would have already collapsed. Having come to this point, though, Lionel had no intention of reeling back now. On this battlefield, other than him, there was no other person capable of dealing with these four. He had to deal with them, and he had to deal with them all quickly before he no longer had the stamina left. The remaining three panicked as Lionel's domain enveloped them. Hearing Candle's screams and watching her get trapped without hope of escaping made them feel as though they could very well be next. In the distance, Anared's frown was deepening. By now, the archers of Hargrove City were supporting him to his back, so the pressure he felt from the 250 or so youths before him shouldn't have been much. But, as though they were rabid beasts without thought for their own safety, they continued to hound him, putting him in a difficult spot. Aina especially seemed to have no interest in letting him retreat. Before, she hadn't been able to use her birthday present due to Vice's interference. But now, she blinked about the battlefield, cutting off Anared's path of escape every time he seemed to gain a bit of daylight. Anared couldn't wrap his mind around just what kind of treasure could allow such frequent and fluid teleportation. However, when he saw that Lionel was actually suppressing the savants, his frown turned somewhat ugly. He couldn't wrap his mind around what was going on. Damn it. If only they had more time to grow. Anared didn't believe that savants were so weak. The only possible explanation was that they didn't have time to blossom to their full potential. And how could they? Savants were existences that could grow more powerful just by eating and sleeping. As long as the world they were born in continued to evolve, so would they. But these savants had spent their lives in a cell. How could they possibly display their true potential? Just when Anared thought the situation couldn't get any worse, his head snapped in a certain direction. At that very moment, from the opposite side of the battlefield, Noah led a troop of youths forward, their number no less than that the 250 or so that harassed him. The troop from the north had finally arrived. Chapter 532. Lionel appeared amidst Vice, Monkey and Lionel. With light steps, his movements became like the breeze. Every motion flowed into the next, every muscle twitch had its own purpose, every start had its end. He embodied the cycle of the Four Seasons to an extreme. And, when this was fused with the winged swordsman style, Lionel became untouchable. Monkey sent out a punch that shattered the sound barrier. Even before it reached Lionel, his arms burst beneath the strain, sprinkling out with drizzling blood. Seemingly noticing his mistake, Monkey rectified it mid-punch. He doubled his Boda's healing factor again and solidified the skin and bone in his arm. On the fly, his attack became several levels more lethal. His eyes, hidden behind his messy, unkempt hair, seemed to light up as though he had learned something new. Initially, all he wanted to do was get rid of the pain he was feeling. After all, he didn't personally experience the deaths of his clones, so he couldn't instinctually react to what needed to be fixed. But now that he had no choice but to attack with his main body, the talent of a savant shone through like never before. While Monkey's punch threatened to take Lionel's head, Vice also reacted. He focused on Lionel once again, his spatial suppression coming down. But, just as easily, Lionel broke through it once again, using the tip of his spear to parry Monkey's fist. Lionel's spear snaked around Monkey's arm like a viper, aiming right for the latter's head. It was simply an impossibility for Monkey's combat awareness to surpass Lionel's. One had practically been on a battlefield for the entirety of the past more than year of his life, while the other was in the first fight of his lifetime. But, just when Lionel's spear would have run through Monkey's head, the latter's neck suddenly doubled in length, bending itself out of the way. His ability. Lionel narrowed his eyes. Among those here, Monkey had the most versatile ability. He seemed to be capable of doing anything with it. By now, Lionel had come to understand that it was a doubling ability and that it seemed to have almost no limits. In fact, Lionel was certain that Monkey had to have doubled his reaction speed and fast twitch muscles as well, or else dodging his counter would have been impossible. The worst part was that the more times Monkey was put in a life-threatening situation, the more ways he learned to get out of it, and the more powerful he grew. If Lionel had to assign a danger level to these savants, Monkey wouldn't even be far behind Lionel, who could even warp reality to his whim. I see. In that case, it'll just bombard you with more new information than you can adapt to. Lionel pulled back his spear, his chains lashing out against Monkey, Vice, and Lionel all at once. By now, Lionel was a shell of his former self. Lionel was too perfect of a counter to him. All he could seem to do was use his ability to escape. But any attempts he made to attack fell flat. Still, his escaping ability alone was giving Lionel a headache. The longer this fight dragged on, the more powerful Monkey became, and there was no guarantee that Vice wouldn't become clever in using his ability as well. On top of that, Candle was still constantly fighting back against his chains, draining his stamina. If it wasn't for the fact he was so focused on keeping Candle trapped, he would have long since made far more use of his domain against Monkey and Vice. If it was up to him, he would have already constricted Candle to death, but he realized that doing so would be no better than suicide for him. Candle's ability was dependent on the strength of her opponent. The more Lionel constricted, the more strength she had to push back, and the greater drain his stamina would experience. To make matters worse, Lionel didn't have to initiate the strength either. At the moment, Candle was pressing her mirrors against her cocoon of chains in order to escape. But, in doing so, Lionel's chains applied pressure in order to stop her. This pressure was then reflected back, causing an endless cycle to ensue. Essentially, the more strength Lionel placed into keeping Candle trapped, the more strength he had to use to resist her entrapment. This left Lionel with no choice but to slowly allow the cocoon Candle was wrapped in to slowly expand. Only by doing this could Lionel slow Candle's escape, but this also put a timer on his battle. There was only so large he could allow Candle's cocoon to become before it exceeded the range of his domain. By then, how could he possibly keep her trapped? Candle seemed to realize this subconsciously, so she formed more and more mirrors, lining them against Lionel's chains and pushing with all her might. However, Lionel was much more intelligent than Candle was. The moment the cocoon around Candle reached 5 meters in diameter, Lionel manifested new chains around Candle, allowing the outer structure to collapse. Candle's mirrors shot in every direction, no longer having anything to press against. But, without her sight, Candle had no ability to gauge just where her mirrors were going as she suddenly found herself trapped once again. Lionel indifferently gazed down toward Monkey, who was brandishing yet another fist at him. He seemed to be completely detached from the events happening around him, as though he was a master puppeteer observing things from on high. Just when Monkey's fist was about to connect, Lionel's body flickered, a halo of golden light enveloping him as his speed reached impossible levels. Monkey's fist lost its target, suddenly finding itself flying toward a mirror. At that same moment, the chains Lionel had sent lashing out at Monkey and Vice aimed for their mirrors as well. The timing was impeccable and the result was devastating. Monkey's fist crashed into the mirror at the same instant Lionel's numerous chains did. Candle's ability was very simple. It had the ability to reflect and multiply the strikes it received. Not only would one have to face the strength of their own attack, but it would also be multiplied in strength by several times. That was already horrible enough, something Coach Owen could attest to. But, what if on top of your own attack, you had to deal with the amplification of several others at the same time? Bang! An entire half of Monkey's body exploded. As though a bomb had gone off within his body, his chest, arm, leg and even half his head erupted into a rain of blood and gore. Chapter 533. A harsh silence overtook the battlefield. Even though Lionel had managed to hold his ground until now, for anyone with battle experience, it was clear that whatever advantage he had had was slowly fading. As the savants became more and more accustomed to battle, their strengths continued to evolve and the upper hand Lionel had had was slowing to a crawl. However, just when others thought that Lionel was about to be forced into a corner, a single move flipped the situation of the battlefield on its head. Everyone was always guessing at what Lionel's ability might be. Some thought his light elemental affinity was the core of his ability, others thought it was his bronze runes, some even believed that it was his spear affinity. Lionel knew well, though, that none of these things were where his true strengths lay. As he stated before, what Lionel grasped from Lionel wasn't the Four Seasons realm. Lionel's understanding the Four Seasons realm could only be considered a byproduct of him finally comprehending the path he should step on. The core of Lionel's prowess was now and would forever be his mind. Lionel appeared before Monkey once again, a cold indifference coloring his expression. Even now, slumped to the ground, Lionel could see that the doubling Monkey had assigned to his healing factor was still in effect. In fact, Lionel could see Monkey's body reforming before his eyes. But, would Lionel really foolishly allow such a thing to happen right in front of him? Lionel stabbed his spear down, skewering Monkey's head. The savant convulsed. Having reached a point that would be impossible for any normal human to return from, one would think that Monkey would be finished. But, Lionel actually felt Monkey's brain trying its best to heal around the shaft of his spear. The reality of it all was baffling. Lionel shook his head. With a flip of his palm, a snow globe appeared and enveloped Monkey's body. Since there was no easy way to kill Monkey for now, Lionel had no issue relying on suspended animation. When Lionel stored Monkey away and looked up, he found that Vice's state might have been better than Monkey's, but considering the fact the former didn't have any healing abilities, their situations might as well have been functionally the same. Vice had flown back like a broken kite, his limbs twisted at awkward angles and his breathing was left shallow. He lost consciousness the moment the pain reached a threshold that was beyond him. Lionel raised his spear to kill Vice, but he hesitated. By now, if he didn't understand the backstory of these prisoners, he wouldn't be worthy of his computational mind ability. However, even if he felt sympathy, he couldn't possibly allow them to do as they pleased. Lionel wasn't certain why the Ascension Empire would choose to keep these savants alive. If they were willing to kill so many of their fellow man to avoid dealing with billions of invalids, why would they suddenly be soft-hearted now? Lionel sighed. His spear descended, piercing Vice through the heart before enveloping him in another snow globe. The savants were simply too dangerous. Though Vice was in a sorry state, if he regained consciousness, his ability would be devastating. Unlike Monkey, he didn't need to move for his ability to take effect. So, Lionel decided to place him on the brink of death. That way, even if by some miracle he managed to escape the snow globe, he would only be mere seconds away from death. Lionel looked toward where Candle was trapped. Even now, she was still struggling and likely had no idea that it was her ability that turned the tides of the battlefield against her favor. Raising a hand, Lionel sent a scorching fire toward her cocoon. Though Lionel had a feeling that Candle could deflect energies as well, what would she do if her deflected energy simply made her situation worse? If she really reflected the heat back while trapped in such a place, she would only be hastening her death. At that moment, Candle's screams shook the hearts of all those who could hear it again. "Stop resisting or it'll burn you alive." Lionel's voice didn't carry a hint of emotion. It traveled to Candle's ears like a reaper's death cry. Any battle veteran would have found another method, any method other than listening to Lionel's words. But, as a naive teenage girl who knew nothing of battle, Candle shook with fear, accepting Lionel's words as gospel the moment she heard them. Just a little heat was enough to scare her out of her wits, the thought of it getting even worse shook her to her soul. Just like that, 3 savants were captured and stored into snow globes, leaving just one remaining. Lionel finally turned his gaze toward Lionel. Lionel shivered meeting Lionel's gaze, hints of madness, rage and fear within his eyes. He backed away, the land to his back warping as he tried to escape once again. By now, the battlefield had completely flipped in favor of Earth. With the addition of Noah's troops, the warriors of Hargrove City were driven onto their back foot. If it wasn't for the fact they had erected a city, they would have likely been forced to flee a long while ago. There was simply nothing for Lionel to rely on. Lionel crossed the distance that separated them. Now that he only had Lionel to worry about, he could focus on disrupting the flow of dream force without powerful enemies looming to his back. The truth was that Lionel's dream force affinity was just as high as Lionel's. What separated them was the use of universal force as a supplemental help. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't currently have a domain that was tailored to his ability, so he couldn't fuse his dream force with universal force like Lionel could. But he didn't need so much to be a disruptor. Lionel found that his hold over his surroundings diminished greatly. The panic in his eyes only grew with each passing moment. Unlike with the others, Lionel had no intention of showing any sort of mercy to Lionel. Though Lionel's backstory was likely no less tragic, he lacked the naivete the others had. He couldn't be allowed to live. Lionel appeared before Lionel. Before the latter could even react, he found a spear shooting through his head. Lionel's voice was lost in a gurgle of blood. Just wanted to see my mother. The bloody angel to Lionel's back shed a tear as its existence crumbled. Lionel didn't show any mercy in those final moments. His fire elemental force exploding along his spear, incinerating Lionel to ash. Chapter 534. Lionel stood with a clenched jaw. He had no idea if Lionel was truly related to him or not, but his last words resonated with his soul. At that moment, Lionel couldn't help but hesitate. The deed had already been done, but had he truly made the right choice? Had this been the right way to do things? Had he been true to himself and done what he wanted, or had he just used the same logic the Empire had only to add his own unique twist? Coach. Lionel didn't sigh a breath of relief when things were over. Instead, he shot backward to Coach Owen. With Vice's ability having been blocked by Lionel for a long while now, medics had long since gotten to the Governor Duke. But whether they'd be able to do anything was a different matter entirely. By now, those guards who weren't of help had been led by Garwin to assault Hargrove City. Among those that remained, they were all the top-of-the-line healers Dark Cloud Prison had to offer. Get away from me, I need to speak to Lionel. Coach Owen pushed the medics away, his tactics just as gruff as usual. But, with how pale his face had become, it was clear he was on his last legs. Even his mustache seemed to have lost most of its earlier volume. Lionel made his way over, a deep frown on his features. Shut up, old man, stop talking. Lionel's frown deepened. He kneeled down, a strong golden light enveloping him as he cast Grand Heal, as best he could. Kid, stop. Coach Owen spoke between coughs. Didn't I tell you to stop talking already? Lionel was exasperated. Was this old man trying to get himself killed? What was he thinking? Coach Owen chuckled. Just look at yourself, kid. You're at the end of your rope, but you're talking about me. Lionel looked up to find the medics giving him worried looks as though it was him with a bloody hole through his stomach and not his coach. But, before he could wonder why, a wave of fatigue grabbed hold of him and refused to let go. What Lionel hadn't realized was that his face had long since been drained of all color. A cold sweat covered every inch of his body and his breathing was short and quick. Yet, he just cast one of the strongest spells he could. He really was asking after death. Lionel grabbed onto his forehead and shook his head furiously. He should have realized. With his ability, everything on the battlefield should have been within his grasp, but because he was so worried about Coach Owen, he hadn't even realized when his perspective on the battlefield had become so shallow. In fact, he hadn't even realized when Noah made it here to support Aina and the others. He simply didn't have the stamina to spare for anything other than his own battle. Lionel looked over his shoulder to find Aina fighting. Her strength seemed to have soared, everything from her power to speed was on an entirely new level. Anared could only continuously retreat beneath her assault. Seeing this, he sighed a slight breath of relief. But, when he relaxed slightly, he felt his vision swim again. Focus up, brat. If I'm going to croak, I need to tell you this first. Lionel wrinkled his nose and shook his head, trying to regain his bearing. "Stop, you're not going to die," Lionel said sternly. "Are you going to let an old man say his final words? Or are you going to keep crying like a little bitch?" "I'm not." Lionel opened his mouth to speak, but a sudden salty taste touched his tongue. He wiped his face with a forearm, only to find a moisture that shouldn't have been there. But, even as he looked into the darkened skies, there were no clouds of rain to be found. "You're a grown man now, brat. I even heard that little girlfriend of yours earlier, she's kicking more ass than you. Is this the face you want to show her?" Lionel's face couldn't be considered any different than usual. In fact, it was even somewhat cold at this moment. Yet, there was no denying the redness of his eyes and the stream of tears flooding his cheeks. It was almost as though he was simply too tired to stop his normal reactions anymore, his body having reached the end of its rope. Sitting at the very edge of exhaustion, his body no longer had the same failsafes it once did. Seeing Lionel remain silent, Coach Owen chuckled. "Finally, took you long enough. You brats these days can never just sit and listen. All of you scram." The medics looked at one another and had no choice but to distance themselves. Coach Owen laid on a concrete, looking up at the sky and the 2 moons that hung above. "I hate to drop this in your lap, but I think a dying man has the right to be a bit willful. I've held this in for a long time and honestly it's eaten me up inside." Coach Owen's voice was as low as a whisper. Lionel could feel his life draining away. "Hurry up, old man. Say what you need to say already so I can stuff you into a snow globe." When Lionel cleared his mind, he realized he had options. Though he wasn't guaranteed to find a method to save his coach, he hadn't lost all hope. He just needed to improve, grand heal. Thinking to this point, he inwardly berated himself for getting emotional. It really must be that his body was at the end of its rope. Lionel was already inwardly celebrating and his mood took a turn for the better. He even thought of making fun of the old man's mustache again. But, what he heard next left him frozen in time. "Lionel isn't related to you, though he probably believes that he is. That said, you're more related than not. You both have the same eye color, same skin tone, same hair color, and were both born in the same month. And, when you were 3 years old, you both took your gene assessments at the same time in the same province. That day, you were both found to be a risk to society and slotted to become dark prisoners." Chapter 535. Lionel sat completely frozen, not understanding what it was that he was listening to. He was supposed to be a dark prisoner. He was the same as Lionel and the others. What the hell was going on? I know that it might be surprising to you, but this is the truth. Back then, you were still a part of the royal family. Though it seems like the Fox royal family is untouchable as the only family that doesn't have to rely on democracy, in order to keep this level of mystique, they have no choice but to be perfect. The idea of a prince suddenly becoming a dark prisoner wouldn't have been a big deal initially, but with the coming turmoil, the Fox family couldn't afford to have any chinks in their armor. In the end, as a commoner, #D1109 had his identity erased and became your replacement. Lionel frowned. There were too many things about this that didn't make any sense. If he was already so high profile, how could he be successfully replaced? In addition, what was the point in replacing him if the main issue was the blemishing of the Fox family? Wouldn't the blemish occur regardless? However, listening to his coach's ramblings, he finally pieced it all together. The gene assessment is technically confidential. This is especially so for high-profile individuals. After all, one had to remember that Anna's 5-star profession was hidden from most so that she wouldn't be harassed at school. However, the royal family was different. In order to breed a sense of superiority, the details of a royal family member's gene assessment was always publicized after the fact. But, that didn't change the initial procedure. Effectively, the test process itself was secret while the results could be publicized at any time depending on what that might entail. After their gene assessments, both Lionel and Lionel were found to be dark prisoners and slated to be imprisoned. Considering the status of dark prisoners, even compared to Anna's 5-star health professional title, they were even more secretive than normal. After all, wasn't the existence of dark prisoners a major secret to the public? Taking advantage of this, Lionel's family was erased. By now, Lionel had no doubt that the Empire had taken advantage of the fall of the Paradise Islands to completely wipe them from existence. However, erasing Lionel was much more difficult. The gene assessment facilities he had gone to that day were top of the line and filled with influential families. Getting rid of his existence would have been impossible. So, that was where Lionel came into play. As children, they looked similar enough to pass for one another, and thus a new Lionel Morales was born while Lionel himself was sent off to Royal Blue Province to live in peace with his father, his results effectively cutting off whatever chance he had had of living in the spotlight as a prince. Understanding all of this now, Lionel couldn't help but feel sick to his stomach. He was a dark prisoner. He was the same as those madmen and women. Lionel's jaw clenched, his body subconsciously leaning back from the body of his coach. He felt a coldness he could hardly control welling up inside. Thinking back to Lionel's last words. "I just wanted to see my mother." Lionel felt as though a knife was being plunged in and out of his chest. Lionel didn't have a name, he didn't have a family, and his only purpose was to find the woman that Lionel's own family effectively erased from existence. Lionel should have been able to accept it. After all, Lionel was going to be a dark prisoner regardless of his existence. In all likelihood, his family would have had to be dealt with regardless. This shouldn't be a burden that Lionel had to bear. But, was it really like this? Wasn't Lionel also supposed to be a dark prisoner? Why wasn't his family erased? Why was it that he was the one who could sit here and pass judgment on a man he was technically no different from? What right did he have? Was he really worth more than another person because his background was greater? Did he deserve more chances because he was more talented? Was this really the kind of world he lived in? A dark fog hung over Lionel. Yip! Yip! The little mink tried to wake him up from the top of his head, yet Lionel couldn't seem to hear the little guy. In fact, even Coach Owen's last words practically fell on deaf ears. Lionel seemed to run into this time and time again. It was a kind of survivor's guilt that followed him since the very start of the metamorphosis. Lionel couldn't help but think back to a conversation he had with Roaring Black Lion all those months ago. It's funny to watch them, don't you think? Lionel chuckled slightly. What do you mean by that? They're separated into two groups. One group is too cowardly to go and wouldn't dare risk themselves. The other is also too cowardly even though they're pushing for us to go. They have no intention of putting themselves in the line of danger at all. They're only so adamant because they think we'll take on the brunt of the troubles for them. Which one do you think is worse? Roaring Black Lion did find this clown show to be quite funny. All of those powerful enough to actually make a difference weren't even speaking. Those like Lionel, him, Thunderous Clap and even King of Sea's group, were all in their own little corners of the cave. It was like they were allowing the weak to make the decision for them. The truth was that since they were the most powerful, they suffered the most to get them here. How could they have the energy to mind this argument? Most of them already made their own decision. Which is the worst? Lionel thoughtfully smiled for a moment. Probably the 7 of us who aren't speaking at all. Lionel felt like that right at this moment. He felt like he was one of those useless 7 once again, not speaking, not doing, just basking in his own talent and allowing the commoners to squabble about as they pleased, knowing that whatever decision they came to wouldn't matter to him in the slightest because he could just do what he wanted regardless since he had the larger fist. And it left him feeling sick. Chapter 536. Lionel. Coach Owen seemed to use the final bit of his strength to break through to Lionel. In return for his efforts, he spit up several more mouthfuls of blood. Whatever bloody bandages that had wrapped around his wound had been completely soaked through once again. Lionel's gaze, which had lost its focus, locked onto his coach again. But, his gaze carried an added vacancy that hadn't been there before. Coach Owen sighed, coughing beside himself. Brat, though I told you these things out of my own selfish desire to vent, these are still important things for you to understand. This is the world you live in. You're one of the lucky ones who can benefit greatly from it. What you choose to do with this chance is up to you and no one else. Lionel didn't seem to react much to Coach Owen's words. He only nodded lightly, his mind not processing things as well as they used to. It was hard to tell whether this was because of his fatigue or if it was because of the information he had just received. Coach Owen shook his head. He knew that his words would have this effect, but he wanted to say them anyway. Though he said it was out of his own selfishness, it was deeper than this. Lionel needed to understand these things. It wasn't just so that he could comprehend his own privilege so that he could decide what to do with it. But, most importantly, if there ever came a day where his talent, his background, or his luck wasn't enough, he would be ready as well. How he chose to navigate these matters would be up to Lionel. Coach Owen would always say that Lionel was the most talented child he had ever come across. Even the savants who were supposedly blessed by the universe fell to him one after another. Though it could be said that these savants were immature, something told Coach Owen that even if they had been training since their youth, Lionel would have still found a way to win. However, this child who seemed to have the world at his fingertips had not an ounce of ambition. This was maybe the most frustrating thing for a mentor to see in one of their youths. Unfortunately, when you came across talents like this, simply telling them that they should be better, that they shouldn't waste their gifts, that they should make the most of the talent they were given, just didn't work. If these talents didn't decide to strive for greatness on their own, there was nothing anyone else could do. The saddest part about all of this was that even if this talent ran into a roadblock, due to their level of genius, they might not even need to try their best to cross it. This led to a perpetual cycle where these geniuses trudged through with a minimum level of effort, until they eventually reached a point where their raw genius simply wasn't enough to cross a new mountain that appeared before them. When geniuses without ambition reached this point, they would experience their first taste of failure in their lives. At that point, the vast majority of them would keel over, allowing the times and despair to roll over them. Their genius would be forever lost in time, a talent that could have bloomed would collapse, never to rise again. Lionel's talent was so outrageous that he would likely travel further than even most of those geniuses. But, there would come a day when he ran into that mountain, a mountain he couldn't climb with just his raw talent. When that day came, Lionel would collapse just like all the geniuses that came before him. Coach Owen didn't want to see such a thing. Lionel was better than most. He wasn't lazy, in fact he was one of the hardest workers Coach Owen had ever seen. But, he didn't have a single, one-minded goal to apply himself to. He had no purpose, no drive. He needed something for himself. Something that could fuel him regardless of outside sources. It couldn't come from his family, it couldn't come from a woman either. Unfortunately, Coach Owen couldn't find this drive for Lionel. He could only point him in a certain direction. This was the last thing he could do for the boy. Coach Owen never had his own family. His wife died decades ago and he never had any sons. To him, Lionel was as close to a grandson as he would ever get. He would do whatever he could to help him spread his wings. Feeling his life waning down to the final embers, Coach Owen swallowed his next mouthful of blood, gathering up the last of his strength. A final thing, kid. About James. Coach Owen sighed, his voice getting fainter. You two have always been like brothers, I watched you grow up. But Brat, you've always been too good at severing your emotions. Somewhere deep down, Coach Owen knew that this was likely one of the largest reasons Lionel was designated as a dark prisoner. But, he could only push this thought away and pray that Lionel would never fall prey to such things. You always have such room for forgiveness for those who are practically strangers to you, but your rope is short for those who you look to as family. In some ways, this makes sense. But, I still want you to open up your heart a bit. I'm not saying to forgive James. Just give him a chance. Take it as a dying old man's final wish. Lionel gazed toward Coach Owen, his irises flickering. All right, Coach, I'll give him a chance. I promise. Lionel spoke softly. Coach Owen's mustache bristled, his lips curling into a bloody smile as he closed his eyes. Lionel took a deep breath, bringing out a snow globe as he felt his coach's consciousness fading. With a thought, his coach being none the wiser, Lionel took his body in. Lionel sat in silence, alone. Even though the sounds of battle drifted to his ears from time to time, he practically blocked them out as though he couldn't hear a thing. One would think that he was in his own world rather than sitting in the middle of a battlefield. But the truth was that he really didn't have the strength to move a finger even if he wanted to. All that was left were his thoughts to distract him from his aching muscles. Chapter 537. Lionel looked off into blank space. His coach's final words about James didn't really register until just now. Could he forgive James? Well, he really didn't know. He didn't even know why it was James had done the things he had, so it was even harder to forgive something like this. As a brother, James should have spoken to him directly. The same words Lionel had said to Aina back then, he could have said to James. The moment someone he was close to stopped trusting him, even going to the point of not even trying to explain things to him first, he had no qualms about them letting them live life without him. If James couldn't trust him enough to speak, was such a person really his brother? Young heir Kia Fur, this is a losing battle. We can't continue to stay here. We've accomplished our goal already. City Lord Hargrove sent a message to Anared. Controlling the savants was never a possibility. The moment they got hold of the A and Dark prisoners, their task was complete. There was no need to continue fighting here. The only reason Anared had stepped out was to ensure the death of Lionel and potentially grab hold of a piece of Earth's world spirit. But, since that was no longer possible with the level of support and reinforcements Earth was getting, it was in their best interest to just cut their losses and leave. In truth, this operation was a resounding success. Lionel's appearance was never part of the plan, so it could be said that they had already accomplished everything they set out to do. Anared, who was still below the city walls, evading the pursuit of several of the youths, didn't react to these words immediately. He sent a glance in the distance toward Lionel's sitting figure. He seemed to be quite listless and out of place. But, if Anared wanted to make it there, he would have to cross through thousands. And, of those thousands, there were 500 who had talent beyond anything one could find on terrain. There's no need to display my full strength now. Retreat is fine too. Anared knew that Hargrove was correct. Their goal was never the savants nor Lionel. From the beginning, their goal had been the escaped prisoners and now they had thousands of them. There was no need to consider anything else for now. Anared's speed suddenly accelerated, dodging out of the way of another one of Aina's axe strikes. Timing his escape the moment Aina used another minor teleportation, he bolted backward, his display far beyond anything he had shown to this point. As for why Anared would be holding back, maybe only he knew the answer to this. No, maybe his fiancée was also aware. In the blink of an eye, Anared had made it to the base of the city. With a single leap, he made it to the top of its walls, a rain of arrows covering his ascent. Start. Anared said indifferently. Lionel's head snapped toward Hargrove City, his gaze narrowing. A strong fluctuation of force suddenly wrapped around it. It didn't take long for Lionel to understand that they wanted to relocate Hargrove City once again. That's possible. Lionel's gaze flickered. He knew more about force arts than probably anyone on Earth currently. A force art drawn with normal materials wouldn't be able to withstand the teleportation of such a large piece of land twice. He couldn't even imagine the amount of wealth that went into building the foundation of these cities to make such a thing possible. Didn't I say you wouldn't? Lionel moved to stand, having every intention of finding a way to stop the city from leaving this place. He had already said that he wouldn't be allowing Anared to leave, and he had no doubt in his mind that he would be able to follow through on that promise in that moment. But, the instant he stood, Lionel's vision suddenly swam. Before he realized what was happening to him, his body fell forward completely outside of his control. The light in his eyes dimmed, his consciousness fading. In the distance, Aina, who had turned her attention back to Lionel, worried about how he might be taking his coach's situation, suddenly cried out in shock. Abandoning thoughts of going after Anared, she shot forward like a streaking shadow. In the darkness of night, Aina's strength was on a whole other level. This wasn't because of her ability, but rather because of the abyss panther blood that she had ingested. Only this sort of environment allowed her to display the true strength of her bloodline. Truthfully, this shouldn't be the case. Unfortunately, Aina's internal sight was weak, so despite her high dark elemental affinity granted by her blood, she had trouble making use of it. Only at night could she overcome these struggles. Of course, there was also the problem of not having any techniques. She had yet to learn any dark elemental techniques, and the innate techniques of the Abyss Panther could only be used once she entered the fifth dimension. So, at this point, she could only accept her shortcomings. Luckily, this speed was enough to make it to Lionel swiftly. Unluckily, though, she wouldn't make it before he crashed into the ground. Thankfully, the little mink was by Lionel's side. With a wave of its little claws, a cloud of darkness stopped Lionel's fall and gently cradled him. By the time Aina made it to Lionel's side, he had entered such a deep sleep that he was even snoring. Aina shook her head, sending a complicated glance toward the disappearing Hargrove city. She was certain that wherever that city appeared next, there would be a whole host of problems to deal with. And she was even more certain that Lionel would be pissed with himself when he awoke to find that he had failed to stop their retreat. Aina sighed and smiled a smile that was one part bitter and another part prideful. If not for Lionel, how would so many of them have survived? But, because he worked himself so hard, he was now in such a state. Let's bring him back, little Blackstar. Yip. Yip. The little mink dove into Aina's chest. The pair walked toward the rest, Lionel hovering behind them on a cloud of darkness, his mind drifting to places unknown. Chapter 538. Lionel's eyes snapped open. His first instinct was to jump up, but the creaking of his bones and his splitting headache made him think twice. The sound of a breathing rhythm Lionel was certain caught his attention. He turned to the side, only to find Aina curled up like a kitten, her mask still on. Lionel couldn't blame her though, it was probably far more comfortable for her to sleep with it on rather than off. Lionel's bed was quite large, enough for even 4 people to sleep on without bothering each other. So, though Aina was curled up to his side, she was still about half a meter from him. Lionel couldn't help but smile. The little mink and Aina cuddled up together was definitely an adorable sight to behold. Lionel's stirring seemed to alert Aina. Her eyes opened only to see Lionel's smirk. A deep blush colored Aina's face. She couldn't help but be thankful that she had this mask now. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Good as N." Lionel hardly finished his sentence before he grunted. His whole body felt like it was cramping. He never thought such a thing could be so painful. Aina frowned. "You pushed yourself too far." Lionel smiled bitterly. He didn't think he had in the moment. He was just doing whatever was necessary to win. But, he hadn't thought that the impact on his body would be so severe. Ultimately, using the Four Seasons realm to display combat prowess beyond his means was like pushing his body past its breaking point. The more he did so, the greater the backlash would be. Though the Four Seasons realm allowed a person to challenge those in dimensions beyond them, there, of course, had to be a price to pay. Luckily, Lionel's body and mind were already within the 4th dimension, or else the backlash would have been even worse. Touching upon the true Four Seasons realm was beyond anything Lionel could have expected it to be. It was only right that there was a small price to pay. However, Lionel wasn't very worried about it. He believed that very soon, he wouldn't have to deal with such backlash at all, not because his body would be invulnerable, but rather because he'd become much better at healing himself. Lionel suddenly grabbed his chest, sucking in a sharp breath. A cold sweat matted his forehead. "Ah!" Aina shot up, waking the little mink. "Lionel? Lionel!" Aina crawled over to Lionel's side, her hands pressing against his chest as she tried to see what was wrong. With her knowledge of the human body, it really wouldn't be much of a problem to do so. After all, she was a 5-star professional. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact her internal sight was lacking, she wouldn't need to touch Lionel at all. But, what happened next left Aina completely stunned. Lionel, who had supposedly just been in pain, suddenly shot an arm around her waist, sending her crashing toward him. Lionel winced before laughing evilly, his master plan having worked to perfection. Seemingly realizing she had been tricked, Aina pouted and tried to push herself up. Ah. Lionel didn't need to fake it this time. Okay. All right. You win. Aina gently lowered herself, inwardly shaking her head. She had given Lionel space so that she wouldn't harm him, only for him to pull such a stunt. Yip. Feeling left out again, the little mink dashed away, likely going to find little Tolly to bother again. You see the things I have to do to get you to say my name? Lionel joked. Aina didn't know how to respond. After a moment of silence though, she said something that left Lionel speechless. Everyone calls you Lionel or Leo. I don't want to be like everyone else. Aina felt very lucky she didn't have to meet Lionel's gaze at this moment. She buried her head into his chest as though trying to find a hole to hide in. Lionel suddenly began to laugh. Aina could feel the rumbling of his chest against her ear, causing her face to redden like a ripe tomato. Aina tried to run away again, but Lionel's pained act caused her to have no choice but to stay in place again. Lionel's laughter waned, leaving a smile on his face. His hand ran through Aina's hair, the smell of apple tickling his nose. You'll never be like everyone else to me. Lionel grinned. For a moment, he felt the pain in his body wasn't so bad after all. The two laid in silence. In fact, Lionel almost lost himself in another round of dreams. If it wasn't for the fact that his mind felt refreshed and he was quite enjoying the feeling of Aina's waist in his arm, he might have drifted off again. Aina's stiffness gradually disappeared after hearing Lionel's words, her hand laying on his chest along with her head. She couldn't help but feel a silent, swelling sweetness. Do you think that Earth will be all right? After asking the question, even Aina felt a hint of surprise. She hardly had any attachments to Earth. To her, whether it survived or not hardly mattered. All she cared about was her revenge. But, she found that after she accepted more of her feelings for Lionel, she began to care more. She didn't know how Lionel felt about the Fox family. But since they were related to him, as long as Lionel wanted it, she would try her best to help. Lionel remained silent for a long while before he spoke. As long as I'm here, no one will touch Earth. Lionel didn't know what this ambition his coach wanted him to grasp was, nor did he care for the Fox much if at all. In fact, it could be said that he leaned more toward hating the Fox family than anything else. Their actions continuously left him disgusted to his core. All Lionel knew was that this was how he felt now. Call it a sense of duty, a foolish pandering, or a gripping guilt, but regardless, this was his resolve. This world was a cruel place. Since he had strength, he would make it just a small bit less so if he could. Okay. Aina smiled lightly. I'll be there too, then. As the couple lay in their own world, a silent rumbling of space shook a small corner of Earth. One after another, troops of soldiers surged out, finding themselves in the middle of a vast ocean. It seemed the powers of terrain had arrived. But, not so unfortunately, their teleportation hadn't been as accurate as their city counterparts. That said, while their location was highly inconvenient, not a single soul of Earth seemed to be aware of their arrival. Chapter 539. Lionel woke from another long sleep, his body still aching. In truth, he wanted to go back to bed again, but he didn't have the luxury. This time, he didn't find Aina by his side. But, with a single sweep of his internal sight, he was able to spot her in the gardens of the abode setting, diligently swinging her sword. Beads of sweat fell from her brow, following the slope of her cheeks and nose. For whatever reason, she had chosen to take off her mask at this moment. But, Knowing her, Lionel didn't need to think very hard to come up with a few reasons. Whether it be to help her training or to be a constant reminder, either one was a safe bet. Lionel sighed but didn't say anything or interrupt her. Wincing, he pushed himself up, finally turning his attention to the world outside. Since he had lost consciousness, he had no idea where he was. Honestly, he had just trusted Aina to put the segmented cube in a safe place and hadn't checked until now. So we're still here. Lionel nodded to himself. Staying near Dark Cloud Prison made sense. In the final moments, in order to stop the escape of more prisoners, Escobar had ordered the sealing of the prison. So, currently, where there had once been a hexagonal prison, there was nothing but the flat ground that had swallowed it. However, this wasn't a long-term solution. The prison needed to be repaired and the prisoners that remained needed to be properly quartered and dealt with. Beyond this, there was also the matter of the already escaped prisoners. Though they all wore wristwatches, without technology, it was difficult to make use of this. On top of this, Lionel had a feeling that the main goal of Terrain had been the prisoners. As for what they wanted them for, it was hard to tell if it was as simple as wanting fifth-generation existences of Earth or if there was a deeper matter. There was the possibility that they simply wanted to make use of Earth's talents. Terrain lacked the most in this aspect. Though they had a great amount of strength, that was bred over decades of training. On the opposing side, though, Earth was able to produce combatants that could face them simply off the strength of their talent and abilities. To make matters worse for Terrain, this only mentioned the youths. There were still a number of old monsters like Old Hutch who not only had talent, but had been training for years as well. Of course, Old Hutch was a member of the Slayer Legion, not the Empire. But, if the Empire didn't have such existences, wouldn't the Slayer Legion have long since won their rebellion? Lionel had the feeling that the Empire wasn't so simple either. That said, none of this stopped him from feeling that he should be wary. Lionel suddenly vanished from within the segmented cube. Noah and Jessica walked toward the segmented cube. From their outward appearances, one would never guess that just a few days ago, Jessica was crying out to save Noah's life. Let alone talking about such a matter, they both pretended as though such a thing had never occurred in the first place. Before they could figure out if they should knock or just wait, Lionel appeared before them. In truth, the current Lionel didn't look the best. His face was still a sickly pale color, a long shot from its usual healthy tan. On top of this, he wasn't the best put together at this moment. Not to mention the fact he wasn't wearing a shirt, he wore pajama bottoms that seemed as though they might slide off his hips at any moment. If it wasn't for the fact he looked so sick, one would have thought he was preparing to model men's underwear rather than coming to greet the Prince and Junior Grand Prime Minister of an empire. However, Lionel couldn't be bothered to care. As expected, sweatpants are still the most comfortable. This whole wearing robe stuff is not for me. As an athlete, Lionel spent the vast majority of his time in sweats. When he could get away with it, he would forego wearing Royal Blue Academy's uniform altogether. Maybe I should just start wearing Valiant Heart Mountain's garbs now. Their pants looked especially comfy, lots of breathing room for the family jewels. Speaking of which, I wonder how many kids Aina wants. I should ask her. On second thought, this isn't exactly the best environment to be birthing kids in. Lionel seemed to have completely forgotten that he, himself, was also still a kid. If Noah and Jessica knew what Lionel was thinking about at this moment, it would be hard to guess how they'd react. They came with such serious expressions, yet Lionel was thinking about something so ridiculous. Finally coming out of his thoughts, Lionel scanned Jessica and Noah. He still didn't know how he felt about this cousin of his. But, he had to admit that he was quite fond of Noah's disposition. Though they had a disagreement over Aina, Lionel could still understand where Noah had been coming from even though he had no intention of forgiving him for the matter. But, from an objective standpoint, Lionel had killed his fair share of people by now. Could he say with any assurance that they didn't have family? Friends? Lovers who would have reacted just like he had in protecting Aina? Knowing this, if he held it against Noah for too long, he would be a hypocrite. As long as Noah didn't target Aina again, he didn't mind building a relationship with this cousin of his. "Good morning," Lionel said with a light smile. His words seemed to alleviate all the tension in the air. Though his face was quite pale, his genuine smile seemed capable of warming even Jessica's cold exterior. Jessica couldn't help but look at Noah's side profile. If you smiled like that, there wouldn't even be a question who Earth's next emperor would be. Jessica inwardly shook her head. Noah was a great talent in almost all aspects. But he was lacking in the social aspect that was necessary to become Earth's next ruler. And, unfortunately, his father was the same. "Good morning," Noah said with a light nod. "We've come for 2 reasons today. The first is for the rewards. But the second is more important." Noah took a deep breath. "I would like to ask you to follow us back to the capital." Chapter 540. Lionel paused when he heard these words. Going to the capital? Just hearing these words seemed to unlock some hidden PTSD he had. Every organization he had joined to this point had found a way to backstab him. Though the matters with Camelot managed to work themselves out and he even got a few good friends out of it, that didn't change the fact that there was a point where practically everyone in that world wanted his head on a pike, despite the truth that, from the very beginning, his only intention was to save all of them. He couldn't help but feel that if he went to the capital now, he'd find himself in another less than favorable situation. And the reality was that this was the very last thing he wanted to deal with at this moment. Lionel couldn't even think about it in terms of seeing his family. He didn't even really see the Fox family in such a light to begin with. As a result, he treated this no differently from an invite to any other organization. Reward? What reward? Lionel evaded the topic. Those who accumulate a certain number of merits in a single battle are privy to an imperial pendant. Your performance happens to warrant a ruby imperial pendant, which allows you to ask one request of Imperial Grandfather. Is that so? Lionel was aware of imperial pendants. They were ranked as black, platinum, ruby, and finally amethyst. Even the lowest was a great honor that one had to scratch and claw for. But, considering Lionel's role in subduing threats that could, without exaggeration, destroy Earth as they knew it, it wasn't too surprising for him to earn a ruby imperial pendant. As far as Lionel was aware, those who had earned black imperial pendants in the past were able to request to have a residence built for themselves in the capital. Compared to the other provinces of Earth, the capital was on an entirely different level. Originally, Lionel had thought that he had never been to the capital before. But, after learning he was a prince, he dug into his own memories once again using his dream force and managed to recognize the fact he had. Just living in the capital increased one's life expectancy by as much as 20 years. This wasn't just because it was safer, but rather because the environment itself was capable of continuously rejuvenating the human body. This was all to say that just the black imperial pendant was worth an extra 20 years of life. This should be enough to demonstrate the worth of such an achievement. In that case, I want to request the rights to White City. Noah's brows shot up. He looked toward Jessica, only to see that she was just as surprised. This. Noah cleared his throat. White City was already requested by Tyrion and the Dove family. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Did he also earn an imperial pendant? Noah shook his head. Is White City considered the territory of the Dove Grand Prime Minister family now? Not exactly. Good. Then I want the city. Lionel replied succinctly. Noah looked toward Lionel, trying to see what his angle was exactly. White City was practically a thankless task to the uninformed. It was filled with citizens who wanted nothing more than to watch Earth fall. Even with 500 elite talents, he was certain that Tyrion wasn't having a good time at the moment. But, for the Dove family, such an action made sense. Though White City was a headache, it also provided an opportunity. It kept all the culture of an entire other world intact. In addition, it was located on Camelot, another place that was practically an untapped treasure trove. Beyond this, White City also represented wealth. At this moment, Earth had yet to truly step onto the dimensional verse stage. But, soon, it would have to. Once that day came, the usual currencies of Earth would become useless and they would have to adapt to using the money of the universe. Though terrain was weak in the grand scheme of things, this was still the wealth of an entire city. On top of this, due to how powerful City Lord White was, White City was prosperous even compared to other cities. Who knew how much money was lying in its vaults? As though this wasn't enough of a pull, the cities of terrain all had teleportation hubs. Earth had yet to set up such things and didn't have laws to deal with their advent just yet either. But, there was no doubt that there would come a day where Earth had to open itself up to the outside world. Though it was dangerous to take this step, it also represented an opportunity. The Ascension Empire of Earth grew so powerful because it was able to fuse the cultures of hundreds to thousands of Earth civilizations from ancient America to ancient Europe and ancient Asia. So, how much more powerful would Earth be if it began to assimilate the cultures of other worlds as well? The main issue, though, was that Earth didn't have any force crafters. This would mean that they would have to rely on others coming to make these teleportation channels for them. Of course, Earth didn't have to worry about no one coming. After all, with Earth's talent, who didn't want a piece of the pie? But therein lied the problem. If Earth didn't control these teleportation channels themselves, they were inviting a whole host of problems. However, what if they stole these already crafted teleportation channels from terrain? It was likely that terrain, too, had to rely on merchants from another world to form their channels. But, could those merchants really come to Earth to reclaim what was theirs? They could try. But whether that would work out for them was still up in the air. This was all to say that White City was a headache that could very well become one of Earth's most important resources. It could only be said that Lionel had a large appetite, Noah sighed. All right. The city is yours. Noah inwardly shook his head. The Dove family won't be happy about this. They're already trying to take 2 cities for themselves, one of which is currently attacking the capital. I wonder how Lionel will deal with this. Though Noah thought that Lionel had done this for the wealth, he couldn't have been further from the truth. Lionel's plans were far more maddening than this. A smirk curled Lionel's lip. He didn't have time to waste on a war with terrain. His top priority at the moment was healing Aina, and he couldn't do that here. For that, he had to head to Valiant Heart Mountain. In that case, he would just have to end this war prematurely himself. Chapter 541. White City seemed to have a veil of darkness hanging over it. This wasn't particularly unexpected. As far as the citizens of White City were aware, they had just lost the war. The truth of the matter was that with how tight-lipped the city lords had been about this operation, the citizens of terrain as a whole knew little about what was happening. It was only after they descended onto Earth that these matters were made known to the masses. Unfortunately for some, not all of the citizens trapped here were even citizens of terrain. Many had come from other worlds to sightsee and purchase various local delicacies and staples. But now, for obvious reasons, the teleportation stations had been shut down. So, these tourists were stuck here in a war they wanted no part of. One way or another, these people would never benefit, so it could be imagined how aggrieved they were feeling. That said, in such a high-stakes environment, not many dared to make their displeasure known on a large scale. By the same token, though, those that did dare to voice out their demands most definitely didn't come from simple backgrounds. This only added to the underlying tension the city was under. It was this situation that Lionel and Aina walked into. They looked toward the looming city gates in silence, their demeanor serious. Are you sure you want to do this? Why even risk it? Aina asked. It can't be for the money, right? Aina could easily see the value of White City. But, unlike the other nobles, Lionel didn't really have any background. As such, he didn't have subordinates in the truest sense. He didn't have anyone who knew how to manage or run a city, nor did he have anyone who could protect and maintain order. Though he technically had those 250 geniuses including Nile, they had been recalled to the capital. In addition, they couldn't be truly considered Lionel's men. After all, he had only known them for a short while. That said, if those youths knew that this was Lionel's thinking, they would be greatly disappointed. Though they had only been with Lionel for a short time, the impression he had left on them was everlasting. They were more than willing to follow him if they were just asked. But Lionel hadn't thought so far ahead. He didn't plan on staying on Earth for much longer. The time for Valiant Heart Mountain's entrance ceremony was quickly coming up, so any thoughts of building up a faction on Earth was too far from Lionel's mind. At that moment, the gates to the city opened as a familiar entourage of people walked out. Among them, there was Tyrion, who seemed to have gotten a new pair of glasses. But, compared to the last pair, it was clear that this one wasn't a treasure, so Lionel didn't say anything about it. Tyrion smiled lightly when he laid eyes on Lionel and Aina walking hand in hand. "I'll be leaving this city in your capable hands, then, Prince Lionel." Tyrion smiled lightly. This was the first time Lionel had heard his voice. Even during the negotiations for Camelot, he hadn't breathed a single word. Hearing it now, Lionel felt that his voice was quite soothing, almost too much so. Such a person had the right to treat their words like gold. It was simply too pleasing to listen to him. Not only was his voice deep, but it came out with a certain smoothness that resonated with the heart. One would think you were being lulled into a land of dreams just being near him. That said, while Tyrion's expression was amiable, the aides following him were quite obviously displeased. Lionel didn't pay very much attention to them, though. Lionel nodded lightly, a warm smile on his face as well. "I'll have to thank you, then. Your efforts are appreciated." Tyrion nodded in response, allowing Lionel and Aina to pass them by and enter the city. The clicking of the large gates caused the ground to tremble. Tyrion and his entourage walked away, brandishing talismans of their own for their use to return to Earth. But, by this point, one of the women following behind him couldn't hold back anymore. "Junior Grand Prime Minister, this is really too much." The blonde young lady stamped her feet, feeling aggrieved. They had already slaved for the past week trying to get the city in tip-top shape. Just when it was finally about time for them to reap their rewards, some long-lost prince swooped in and stole all their hard work. How could she not be pissed? To make matters worse, though some of them had suggested undoing the work they had done and causing some petty problems for Lionel, Tyrion rejected their thoughts in the end. Ultimately, Lionel was handed a city on a silver platter and hardly had to do any work. At this point, his only task was to maintain. Yet, their junior Grand Prime Minister acted as though these matters had nothing to do with him, walking away with a light smile on his face that hadn't faded even now. Seeing that Tyrion didn't explain, the blonde young lady was practically blowing steam out of her ears. Her foot stamped the ground again, but her strength was so great this time that spider webs formed beneath her heels. Somehow, though, her shoes survived the devastation. It was clear that they weren't normal by any stretch. Still, this young lady had the right to be quite willful. At the very least, there were very few people who could reprimand her. Though she didn't have a title like Junior Governor Duke, her father and mother both were from Tier 9 court minister families. Her standing was even higher than a Junior Governor Duke as a result. The untitled nobles of the capital were more respected than out-of-capital nobles by a large margin, especially Tier 9 officials. "This is just the way of the world." Tyrion replied with a smile. "The powerful do as they please and the weak move aside. Is there really any problem with that?" A silence fell over the entourage, the sound of their footsteps resounding through the darkness. Chapter 542. Lionel walked into the city to find it quite silent. It was clear that Tyrion and the others had done an excellent job. By now, the patrolling troops had been replaced with officials of Earth, a stark change from the 500 youths that had been tasked with maintaining order previously. Though these men and women were less powerful, their training was more substantial and, most importantly, there were far more of them. Seeing Lionel's entry, the head of the patrol units came forward quickly, saluting respectfully. "Prince." Lionel still couldn't quite get used to this form of address. But, he thought it would be a bit ridiculous if he asked them all to call him captain, so he let it slide. The patrol. Lionel shook his head. It's fine, you don't need to explain these things to me. I'll be headed to the city lord's mansion. Just be prepared to see to my orders. Here. Lionel handed the head patrol guard a talisman that would make communication smoother. To Lionel, drawing such a talisman was as easy as breathing. Though Lionel hadn't had any formal training in talisman drawing and it could be considered a profession outside of force crafting, their roots were practically identical. In fact, Lionel was probably better than most low-level talisman crafters thanks to his ability. The profession relied on precision and accuracy, and these were things that Lionel was best at. The head patrol guard was a bit taken aback by Lionel's dismissiveness. But, he still respectfully accepted Lionel's talisman and watched as the pair began to walk around the city seemingly without aim. Every so often, the patrol units would come across Lionel and Aina. Without fail, each would immediately respectfully bow before continuing along their patrolling routes. What of them expected, though, was for this stroll of Lionel's to last so many hours. Initially, many of the patrol guards couldn't help but compare Lionel to Tyrion. If one were comparing the two, it was obvious who was the better at administration. Lionel couldn't even bother to listen to the layout of the city, even to the point of not even asking for a map. In truth, many of the patrolling guards thought that Lionel had lost his way to the city lord's mansion and was now far too embarrassed to ask. But, as Lionel continued to walk around the city, the expressions of the patrolling guards only became weirder. Whereas before they thought that Lionel was aimlessly wasting time, now they weren't so sure. Even if someone wanted to waste time, shouldn't they do it with something enjoyable? Of course, Lionel was having great idle chatter with Aina. Every so often, her laughter would ring through the empty streets and catch the attention of the citizens peeking out their windows with hostile expressions. But, even if Lionel's goal was to enjoy his time with Aina, wouldn't they have been better suited in a bedroom? There wasn't even anything to see on the streets. By now, all the stalls were empty, the restaurants were closed, and the citizens were closed off in their homes without the option of stepping out. Just what could there be to see? Yet, Lionel obviously didn't explain himself. He walked down street after street, having a nice chat with Aina. In truth, this had been the longest time Aina spent relaxing in a very long time. Though she felt one part guilty, she couldn't help but feel another part ease as well. This feeling was completely new to her, she couldn't help but enjoy it. Her hand felt very secure in Lionel's. "I'm serious," Lionel said sternly. "You're insane." Aina rolled her eyes. "No person in their right mind would agree with you. It's perfectly logical." Lionel stood his ground. Aina stopped walking, her gaze locking onto Lionel's. "Only psychopaths put milk in first." "Oh, come on. Think about it." Lionel refused to back down, his eyes lighting with a wild light. "If you put in milk first, you can control the amount of cereal. If you put in the perfect amount of cereal, you can finish it all before it gets soggy. Then, you can incrementally add more cereal. You can savor your meal in peak condition. If you put in cereal first, then pour in the milk, unless you're a speed eater, by the time you get to the bottom, you'll have nothing but soggy cereal left. It's practically science. There's nothing wrong with soggy cereal, it's a way of life. Next thing you know, you'll be saying that peanut butter is more important in a peanut butter and jelly sandwich." "Well..." Aina was stunned. "You've got to be kidding me. Pretend like you don't know me." "Hold on," Lionel protested. "Jelly is like the icing on a cake. Even though it's good, you can't just make a cake entirely out of icing, right? Peanut butter is the foundation. You have to have more of it. I'm done with you." Aina walked away, pretending to ignore Lionel. "Aina, don't walk away. We need to seriously talk about this. Our children need to be educated properly." Aina turned back, a furious blush hiding behind her mask. "Who's going to have children with you?" Lionel grinned, his smile lighting up the night sky. Good, at least I've still got your attention. I'll slowly teach you the right way to view the world. I can compromise on the PB&J, but I'm drawing a hard line at milk first. I'm trying to start a revolution. Aina shook her head, giggling. Seeing Lionel treat something so trivial so seriously made her oddly happy. After pretending to be angry for a while, Aina eventually let Lionel take her hand again as they walked down the streets. Done. Lionel walked to a dead end with Aina by his side. By now, he had walked down every street the city had to over and mapped it all in his mind. He hadn't missed out on a single detail. Is it possible? Aina asked. It should be. Lionel responded after a long while. It will depend, though. On what? On how many spies Terrain left in the city. Chapter 543. It seems that they've swapped out the city lord. The name of this person is Lionel Morales. He seems to be one of the prime targets for the world spirit hunt. In hushed tones, voices communicated back and forth within a residential area of White City. Oddly enough, despite the fact they didn't try to lower their voices in the slightest, if one stood more than a half-meter away from them, hearing their words at all would be a fool's dream. The people of Terrain weren't fools. It was an impossibility that they never considered what might happen should a city of theirs be captured. They were well aware that despite the fact Earth was a fledgling world, the threat they posed to a weaker world like theirs was astronomical. As such, Terrain's goal was never to be perfect. Rather, they had planned for decades and as such had decades worth of contingency plans. Just one of these contingencies were the spies left within the city. These people were regular residents. Not only had they not joined the war efforts, but they had even lived in this city for years now. Even if one interviewed every citizen of Terrain, it would be impossible to weed them out. Not only had these people been deeply undercover for several decades, but they were highly intelligent and adept at hiding themselves. There was simply no chance at finding them with any sort of ease. Even Tyrion got a headache dealing with them all. However, Lionel wasn't Tyrion. With a flip of his palm, Lionel retrieved the other half of the communication talisman he left with the head of the patrol units. Hello. Right, I have no idea what that prince is. Ah. Yes. Prince. At your service. Aina giggled to the side as Lionel shook his head. If he had really wanted to, he could have been listening in on their conversation from beginning to end. It was just that he didn't have the mind to care about the thoughts of these patrolling guards. Actions spoke louder than words. Prepare 38 tactical units. No single group can be made of less than 10 individuals. Prepare yourselves to be swift, decisive and safe. Prince? The head of the patrol units was clearly confused. Where was all of this coming from? What were these units for? Don't ask any questions. Speed is of the utmost importance. Ready yourselves now and go to these locations. When Lionel disconnected the call, the looming darkness over White City seemed to grow heavier. Lionel stood silent before the city lord mansion, his eyes closed. Begin. The moment his words fell, the city descended into chaos. The sound of breaking doors, screaming women and children, and the loud badgering shouts and roars of men resonated. Lionel sighed lightly. But he didn't make any moves to stop it. This was war. He had no doubt that of those he caught this time, a majority of them would choose to commit suicide. And, of those who failed to go through with it, their states wouldn't be much better. To make matters worse, these spies had long since settled down in the city. They had family, they had friends, they had wives, they had children. In most cases, these family members wouldn't even be aware of the hidden purpose of these spies. All they would see was the fact someone they loved was being dragged away and, in some cases, killed. War was truly a cruel thing. Despite the fact Lionel got to stand here and didn't need to witness any of it personally, he still felt his stomach churn. The feeling was no different from the first time he killed a man. And somehow, he felt that this feeling was even worse in some ways. "Are you all right?" Aina asked softly. Lionel smiled somewhat bitterly. "I'm not, but I will be," he finally replied with a sigh. Aina squeezed Lionel's hand. In truth, she didn't feel much from this matter. One would think that she, as a woman, would be more empathetic than her boyfriend. But this wasn't the case. Compared to Lionel, Aina had long since seen the cruelty of the world. In her opinion, Lionel's actions were even more benevolent than they would be had anyone else gone through with them. At the very least, he could pinpoint the exact spy. Aina was certain that if Tyrion was left to do this, he would simply wipe the entire family from the face of Camelot. "Is that all of them?" Aina asked after another long while. Lionel shook his head. "There's still one more group in this city that even Tyrion likely didn't suspect. Because if he did, he wouldn't have left them where he had." "One more." Aina's expression was confused for a moment before they suddenly lit up beneath her mask. "You mean?" Lionel nodded. "That's right. This one, we'll have to do personally." Lionel and Aina walked toward the city lord's mansion. In this place, there was a large military field out front, completely unlike other mansions. Whereas most would opt for lush gardens and maybe a few koi fish ponds, City Lord White hadn't bothered with any such pomp and circumstance. However, compared to the past where these fields had been nothing but deep foot marks, sweat, and blade scars, it had been completely revitalized. Now, there were numerous luxurious homes, looking completely out of place. Of course, these homes were recently built and may have even been the work of Tyrion and the others. Lionel understood Tyrion's actions in this regard. But just because he understood them didn't mean he accepted them. With steady steps, Lionel strolled into this makeshift community of rich folk with Aina by his side. Considering it was late at night, other than a few flickering lights behind their luxurious curtains, there was nothing else to see in the streets at all. Obviously, people of their standing wouldn't necessarily go to bed so early. But, though Tyrion had given them some advantages, he wouldn't go too far. So, these nobles had to abide by a certain curfew. It seemed that the sudden restlessness of the city had shaken these people, because they obediently followed these protocols. At that moment, Lionel suddenly released Aina's hand and clapped his own together forcefully. What did it sound like for skin as tough as fourth-dimensional metals to slap together with such strength? Well, the moment Lionel's palms collided, it felt as though an explosion had erupted. Without him even having to say a word, these nobles scurried out of their homes, a mixture of shock, fear and confusion on their faces. Chapter 544. In any other context, the sight would have been hilarious to behold. Some ran out with shower caps and robes still on their bodies, others only had a single slipper on, and still yet some others had forgotten their pants. If they were acting, Lionel had to admit that they were quite good. But, there were still a few people he managed to pick out that were different from the rest. He indifferently waited for all of these nobles to step out of their homes, the combination of his silence and the chaos of the city acting as his backdrop making those who definitely weren't acting gulp. At that moment, a fat man practically waddled out from his door. Despite the time of night, thick chains, bracelets and rings could be found all across his body. Considering the sleep in his eyes, this man either really slept with such jewelry on, or he was really committed to always looking as rich as possible when he stepped into public view. As for why he didn't take his boda's size into account when portraying this image to the public, maybe only he knew. The fat man looked around, and seemingly realizing that Lionel was in charge, his bubbling face turned red with anger. What is the meaning of this? Haven't I already explained who I am? You dare wake me up in the dead of night? Lionel indifferently watched this man go on a rant, but Aina furrowed her brows. There was nothing Aina hated more than those who flaunted their status. In fact, she felt a deep loathing for such people. If she didn't know better, she would cleave this man in two just to teach him a lesson. You seem to be new, so I'll take on the labor of explaining it to you peons again. I am a one-star black merchant of the Milky Way Guild. You dare to treat me like this? The surrounding nobles seemed to be emboldened by the fat man, and they began to rant one after another. Since another had taken the first step, their fear vanished and they began to brandish their egos and backgrounds as though they were true weapons. I've said it before, I'm a citizen of planet Kars X10. Do you know how my government officials will react if they hear that a single hair on my head has been harmed? Right. And I'm a citizen of planet Solvus X2. The words seemed to layer atop of each other, bleeding into one another. Is there a reason their planets all have numbers behind them? Lionel asked Aina curiously, as though he couldn't hear their frustration. Aina looked at Lionel incredulously before shaking her head and giggling. Maybe only Lionel would be able to ask such a thing at this time. The universe is big as it is. So, instead of giving each planet a world conquers a new name, they essentially add an alphanumeric code word to the end of the main world's name as a suffix. X, Y, and Z are the letter parts of the code. X means that this world is on the same dimensional plane as the main world. Y means that it's a step below. Z means that it's 2 steps below. As for 3 steps below, it's not usually worth it for such a high-level world to invest in such a planet, so there's no designation for it. As for the numbers, they're pretty self-explanatory. Just designates a number to the planet. The larger the number, the more planets a world has under its control. 10 is a pretty high number, honestly. Most are around 2 or 3 at this stage. Kars is a powerhouse of our quadrant. I see. Lionel and Aina continued to chat as though the ravings of these nobles had nothing to do with them. By now, it was obvious that these weren't nobles of White City at all. Rather, they were the tourists mentioned previously. Each had an entanglement with another world and had come to Terrain for one reason or another. Some came for business like the fat merchant, but there were others who had come for pleasure. By extension, it should also be obvious why Tyrion had treated them so well and hadn't considered the possibility of spies being among them. Earth might be talented, but it was still a fledgling world. Simply put, they couldn't afford to enter the world of the dimensional verse with hostile entities on all sides. There were already no shortage of individuals who were jealous of them. They couldn't also then proceed to antagonize these worlds further. So, maybe it was more accurate to say that Tyrion likely thought of the possibility that there might be more spies amongst the people of these worlds, but didn't dare to act upon this speculation. However, once again, Lionel wasn't Tyrion. That's enough. Lionel's voice suddenly boomed. An oppressive might shook these nobles awake. Let me make one thing clear. Lionel spoke, a cold edge gliding across his tone. Earth indeed can't afford to offend all of your worlds. A smug look resurfaced on the faces of the nobles that had been scared witless once again. That said, Lionel's steely continuation made their sneers freeze on their faces, their hearts trembling beneath his presence. You all should also understand that Earth is not a world that you can afford to offend either. We may be young, but we are no pushovers. If you think that you can use the status of your worlds to apply pressure on me, you'll be sorely mistaken. Lionel's gaze swept over them all. Now, will you all step out and personally hand yourselves in? Or do you want me to take action personally? Because I promise you, if you choose the latter, your experiences will be much worse than them. Lionel hooked his thumb over his shoulder, pointing back toward the city behind them. A silence hung over the nobles. At that moment, the shouts and screams of the city suddenly became several levels more obvious. A sharp light lit the gazes of several within the crowd, a hesitancy causing their hearts to beat erratically. Chapter 545. I guess that's your choice then. Lionel's palm flipped over. Before anyone could react, his bow had been knocked with 3 arrows. Though his gaze was indifferent, a stifling killing intent loomed overhead. I'll ask you one more time. Are you 3 going to step out on your own, or would you rather an arrow through the head? Lionel speaking out the exact number made those who had just been hesitating feel their hearts seize. How did he know this? The worst part was that Lionel had come to them before they could even think of reporting these matters. It was difficult to tell exactly what was going on in the city, so those who were spies could only rely on their abilities. But, before they got a good understanding of what was happening, Lionel had appeared here and startled them all awake. You aren't even people of terrain. Is money really worth your life? Lionel's back flexed, pulling his bowstring back. Tyrion wouldn't make the mistake of taking these people at their words. If they were here, that meant that they most definitely were people of other worlds. As for how Tyrion knew this, Lionel wasn't sure. But, Lionel himself could pick out the subtle differences. Of course, a person from a world wouldn't necessarily have the same appearances. This wasn't a matter of how they looked, but rather about the way the energies around them behaved. People from the same world had subtle nuances about them that Lionel was able to pick out. Just from a casual observation, Lionel was able to pick out these people with ease. That said, there was no telling if Lionel was correct. It was always possible that these people had deeper ties to terrain than it seemed. But, it was worth a try. Alright then. Die. Lionel's gaze sharpened, landing on the first figure. Just as his bowstring was about to be released, two figures dashed forward, quickly falling to their knees. I surrender. I surrender. They both spoke in unison, their head lowered to the ground. It was clear that they were too afraid to even look up. Before, they had thought that Lionel was just bluffing. But, after Lionel not only spoke out with the number of them that there were, but also locked his aura onto them, they felt as though they had fallen into the pits of despair. The only ways they could see to save their own lives was by surrendering. Humph. Just a bunch of trash. When others heard this voice, they were surprised to find that the obese merchant was on the other side of it. This man who seemed to be all talk and no substance actually had the gall to say such a thing at this moment. You're quite bold, brat. The obese merchant snarled. How did you manage to pick us out? Lionel gazed indifferently at the obese merchant who very clearly had no intention of begging for his life like the two before him. At the same time, though, Lionel also had no intention of explaining how he had done things. Since it was related to his ability, why would he expose such things about himself? The obese merchant snarled when he noticed that Lionel had no intention of saying anything. Even if you knew that we were responsible, you should have turned your head the other way, kid. Do you think that the Milky Way Guild is an existence you can afford to offend? The obese merchant began to speak of his background again. But, whereas last time it came off more like a spoiled brat talking about his rich parents, at this moment, it felt as though a mountain was weighing down on all those around him. This was no longer an explanation. It was a threat. Since you're a fledgling world, I don't mind explaining. Earth is only located on a tiny little wing of the Milky Way galaxy. Even if your technology was at its peak, you could at best travel to another wing if you spent your whole lifetimes on it. But, the Milky Way galaxy has control of all the trade routes of this quadrant. It's impossible for a... Lionel suddenly held up a hand. With a thought, the little mink appeared, holding a familiar disc-like dictionary in his little paws. Who is the highest-ranking member of the Milky Way Guild? The obese merchant sneered. What did this little brat think that he was doing? Were these matters something an infant world like Earth would know? Did he really think that his little informational treasure would be able to give him such information? Was this supposed to be a comedy skit? Ping *, replying to Seed, the highest-ranking member of the Milky Way Guild is Augustus Ovaltine, and what's his strength level? Ping, replying to Seed, Augustus Ovaltine, when last displaying his prowess, showed strength nearing the 6th dimension. What are the odds Augustus will care about a 4th-dimensional 1-star black merchant? The obese merchant nearly choked on his spit, his visage becoming deathly pale. Calling the president of the Milky Way Guild by his first name as though it was a non-issue? Just who was this kid? And what the hell is that disc? The merchant had heard that Earth was a treasure trove of wealth, but seeing it with his own eyes made him feel as though he had lived his life to this point for naught. Ping, replying to Seed, it depends on if matters are related to Earth or not, Lionel nodded. Earth was too much of a temptation. Even if this Augustus wouldn't normally care about the life of a one-star black merchant, if it came down to it and he could use it as an excuse to stretch his hands toward Earth, he wouldn't hesitate. In fact, considering there was a merchant here at all likely meant that his sights were already locked onto their world. Since this was the case, how should he deal with this matter? Chapter 546. Lionel's bow disappeared, only to be replaced by an odd metal. Just looking at it, one couldn't feel anything special. It looked even less special when Lionel bent it in his hands as though he was pleating fabric rather than a metal bar. But, when the two kneeling figures felt this metal wrap around their wrists and lock into place, they felt as though they couldn't exert any strength at all. After he was done, Lionel walked to the obese merchant who was still sickly pale. He didn't seem to realize that the last response by the dictionary gave him some breathing room, likely because the pressure Lionel put on him was too much. Or, more accurately, it was Aina's pressure. From the very beginning, Aina had had a bad impression of this man. So, the moment she found out that he was one of the spies, she no longer held back her killing intent. Luckily, it seemed that this merchant was more adept at selling wares than battling. But, this only made sense. After a world completed its first metamorphosis, it would slow into a lull. By then, not everyone needed to be combatants any longer. On the current Earth, practically everyone needed to know how to fight with the exception of a few. However, as things settled down more, it was likely that Earth may return to the previous days where the army and a regular citizen's life were kept separate. Lionel didn't wait for the obese man to finish and simply locked his arms into place just like his colleagues. This metal bar was the very metal used to line the walls of Dark Cloud Prison. With all the destruction, Lionel managed to snap a few pieces for himself with quite some ease. Now, he wouldn't have to worry about these spies using secret means of communication. Though Lionel could easily see through more conventional communication methods, stopping abilities would be more difficult. The reason he was able to weed out the spies to begin with was because White City simply made it too easy. Every spy, without fail, had communication force arts drawn into the foundations of their home. Not only were there communication force arts, but there were also force arts that made monitoring the city several times easier. Of course, the obese merchant and his two accomplices were a bit different in this regard since their homes were only recently built. But, even then, seeing through them hadn't been very difficult. Lionel only had to pay attention for special talismans. Since the merchant and his men weren't citizens of White City to begin with, it was obvious that the people of Terrain would account for this, giving them more mobile options for espionage. For someone with senses as sensitive as Lionel's, seeing through these hidden mechanisms was simply too easy. The main mistake White City made was that it didn't consider the fact that someone knowledgeable about force arts would even exist on Earth to this point, and this could be considered their downfall. In the end, Lionel chose to simply imprison the members of the Milky Way Guild. He could tell that this might lead to problems later, but he couldn't afford his plans being revealed, even if there was only a small chance. A long while later, the spies who survived the purge were grouped together and thrown into the White City dungeons. As a city, there was no surprise that White City would have such a thing, so it made things many times more convenient. The patrol units looked toward Lionel in a completely different light. With their training, they could easily tell that Lionel had indeed picked out spies. If it was just an act, maybe their disdain would have reached another level. But, this was very clearly not that. "Station a few to look over this area," Lionel said. "Yes, Prince." Lionel walked away, not minding their change in attitude. To him, actions always mattered more than words. Now that all the spies were dealt with, he could really begin. As for what he planned to do, well, the people of Terrain liked dropping cities onto battlefields, right? He might as well give them a taste of their own medicine. On a secret location on Earth, there was yet another meeting taking place. The war for Earth was reaching a new level. But, everyone knew that unless the capital fell, Terrain would be left with nothing. Of course, Terrain had their own plans in this regard, but the truth was that they were making no progress on that front, at least on the surface. This meeting, however, didn't include people of terrain, nor did it include people of the Empire. Rather, each and every soul here was an upper echelon member of the Slayer Legion. Among those present, there were several that Lionel would recognize. The first of which being Supreme Monet. Aside from her, there was even the angelic man who appeared that day to stop Hutch, and there was even Hutch himself. The old man lazed around as usual. But, compared to when Lionel first saw him, aside from having his feet up on the table, the old man also cradled a machete resting in an age-worn leather sheath. His head nodded away as though he might fall asleep at any time. In fact, even though the conference table was practically packed to the brim, there wasn't a single soul within a meter of Hutch. It was as though they all tacitly agreed to stay away from him. Still, though many avoided Hutch, their focus wasn't on him at all. Rather, they were all focused on a particular young man. Despite the fact that he was the youngest in attendance, many looked toward him with awe and respect. Some gazed toward him with fear, and still others looked upon him with admiration and anticipation, as though he was a shining hope prepared to change their futures. The young man had striking blue eyes and hair whiter than snow. Despite this, his skin was a deep shade of brown. It was a warm, gentle sort of brown that reminded one of a wizened oak tree. The young man sat quietly, as though he was waiting for something. But, seemingly without cause or reason, he sat up slowly, his gaze brimming with vitality. If citizens of Terrain had been present, they would have immediately recognized this young man. He was other than the first on their list of targets, the young man who cleared the zones of Earth the second fastest. Ellerin. Chapter 547. If matters continue like this, Terrain will lose. Ellerin's voice held a certain sweetness to it. It was deep and reverberating, but it tickled the ears almost like a steady rhythm. It had a special cadence to it that dragged all those who heard it in. But, maybe his words themselves were more shocking than anything else. According to Ellerin, despite the state of the battlefield and the current semi-stalemate, Terrain had not a single chance of winning. If the outside world heard such things, they would think that this man was insane. However, the members of the Slayer Legion only nodded as though this was obvious. As the existences that had been battling the Empire for so long, they had a great understanding of their strength. If Terrain thought their pitiful planning was enough, they were sorely mistaken. The reality of it all was that Emperor Fox was simply unfathomable. As long as that man didn't deem it fit to make a move, Earth was in no danger whatsoever. However, that very man, at this moment, was more than content to leave this war as a training exercise for the youths of Earth. And, maybe the sad part was that Terrain had yet to realize this was the case either. They simply weren't being taken seriously. Of course, if one looked at this at a surface level, Ellerin's words were already shocking enough. But, if one was aware of how many things he was aware of, they would be even more astounding. But, I'm sure you're all aware that it's impossible for things to simply continue like this. Those hidden families will not miss this opportunity to deal a blow to the Empire, they're only waiting for the opportune time. And, there's no guarantee that other worlds haven't already stuck their noses into our matters. So, the question remains. What will we do about it? A silent hush fell over the Slayer Legion. Ellerin stood from his seat. He wore a tracksuit that radiated a pure white color. Despite the casual nature of his dress, it didn't seem out of place in the slightest. In fact, it felt as though he was a monk looking down upon them from on high. Just his demeanor alone felt otherworldly. Not many know the history of the Slayer Legion, and even less know that we are no less ancient than the Ascension Empire. However, we've been hiding in the shadows for a long time. Sometimes, I believe that even we forget what our true purpose is. Ellerin swept a gaze over those before him, his demeanor completely unlike what his age would dictate. He commanded the room of such powerful individuals with ease. Well, with the exception of a single man. Hacker Hutch continued to nod away, mumbling beneath his breath as he whispered sweet nothings in his sleep. Ellerin smiled when his gaze landed on Hutch. He didn't seem irked by such a reality at all. In fact, He only shook his head as though he was observing his own grandfather napping at an inappropriate time. There wasn't a hint of animosity in his expression. Hutch. The angelic man growled. Huh. Huh. Hutch shot up, looking around warily. When he realized where he was, he yawned. Oh, this meeting is still going on? The angelic man's fury reached a new level seeing such a display. Show some respect. Respect? Hutch picked at his ears. You're all fawning over a brat who hasn't even grown hair in all the right places yet, and now you have the audacity to ask me to show some respect? The hell is wrong with you? Hutch yawned again, smacking his lips. I could do with some pizza. The old man mumbled beneath his breath. By this point, not only was the angelic man fuming, but so were the others. This was especially so for Catrice, who had lost an arm to Hutch just months ago. The emptiness of his sleeve brought him to a boiling rage every time he thought of those events. Grandpa Hutch. I heard that Mayfly died. Hutch's gaze narrowed as he looked back toward Ellerin. The relationship between Badger and Mayfly might have been close, but compared to the relationship between Mayfly and Ellerin, it was hardly worth mentioning. It could be said that Badger's emotions were unrequited while it was a completely different story for Ellerin's. This might have shed light on just the kind of man Ellerin was. Despite all of these matters, he still didn't blink an eye when Mayfly and Badger partnered up so frequently. This was a man wholly confident in himself and his ability. It's been quite a long time since you've called me Grandpa, brat. But, to think that this was the situation you would do so in. It seems that you've gotten quite used to playing these political games. Maybe rather than my being the one who's forgotten the true purpose of the Slayer Legion, it's you all. Hutch stood, his demeanor becoming completely different. It was clear that even Ellerin became a level more serious. I hadn't made my decision before, but I'll have to thank my own grandson for pushing me in the right direction. It seems that I can no longer take a back seat to these affairs any longer. By the time Hutch made it to the front of the room, his aura was towering. Whatever demeanor that Ellerin seemed to have had was completely washed away in the presence of this old man. Slowly, Hutch's skin seemed to become more elastic, his wrinkles fading somewhat. He became an inch or two taller and his aura sharpened, regaining a bloody edge that had disappeared long ago. Even beneath the gazes of so many powerhouses, his aura seemed to wash over them all, suffocating them to the point it seemed they wouldn't be able to raise a single finger. He was on a completely different level. It was only at this moment that they all understood the level of strength Hutch commanded. Even if he hadn't awakened such a rare time affinity ability, even if he hadn't awakened an ability at all, he would still carry strength capable of forcing them all to submit. This was Hutch. This was Old Man Hutch. This was Hacker Hutch. From this day forth, the sole decision-maker of the Slayer Legion will be me. Chapter 548. Hearing Hutch's words, those of the Slayer Legion were stunned. At first, they were too oppressed by Hutch's aura to say much of anything. But, in the next moment, a few shot up, livid expressions on their faces. You dare to rebel, Hutch? Catrice roared, slamming his remaining hand onto the table beneath him. Catrice hadn't dared to confront Hutch before, but now he was most definitely in the right. Wasn't the point of the Slayer Legion meant to be to fight against the oppressive rule of the Empire? The Ascension Empire hid beneath the guise of democracy, but when there would always be one, undeniable ruler, what kind of democracy was this? This world was simply a monarchy with extra steps, there was nothing revolutionary about it. Just how many actions had the Fox family unilaterally taken over the years with no one being powerful enough to stop them? This was exactly what they were trying to avoid, yet, Hutch was actually trying to make the Slayer Legion the exact thing they were fighting against. It was unforgivable. Silence. A wave of force surged through the room. Many felt as though their knees had gone weak, whatever thought of resisting they had falling to negligible levels. Even now, they couldn't believe how large the difference between them and Hutch truly was. Brat, go sit down. Hutch looked toward his grandson, a commanding tone booming from within his chest. Ellerin looked toward Hutch, a partially cautious and partially curious light in his eye. But, in the end, he smiled somewhat unexpectedly. "All right, Grandpa." It was simply too difficult to read Ellerin. He really did seem like a kid trying his best to please his grandparent. But, just a moment ago, he was questioning his grandfather about the death of Mayfly. Of course, there hadn't been any sort of edge to his tone back then. But, asking such a question in context most definitely seemed to be combative. Yet now, Ellerin pretended as though of that had happened. Hutch turned away from his grandson, looking back toward the crowd of Slayer Legion elites. By now, many of them had paled. Without Ellerin's presence blocking Hutch, the aura they felt came like a rampaging tsunami, crashing into their minds and hearts with a relentless tempo. "Since you all seem to have forgotten the truth of our Slayer Legion, I will remind you. We weren't built to be rebels, we weren't built to help the common people, we weren't built to sit here and scavenge for opportunities to deal with the Empire. The truth of our existence is in our name. We, the Slayer Legion, was built to kill." A bloodthirsty aura surged out from Hutch. The sound of crying blades sung through the air, sharpening beneath Hutch's aura as though it was their perfect whetstone. Not a single soul seemed capable of breathing, let alone moving. It felt as though their whole world suddenly revolved around this one man. "We plunder. We kill. Then we sharpen our blades and do it all over again. This is the fundamental law that rules us, that rules me." Monet. Supreme Monet was shaken out of her fear-induced state. "Why yes. What is the history of the Slayer Legion?" "We." Monet grit her teeth and stabilized her breathing. "We were once the spear of the Empire. However, we grew too dangerous and were thus abandoned and shunned. It was too difficult to control so many powerhouses at once, so the first emperor of the Ascension Empire had us hunted down and killed." If others heard this story, they would have been shocked beyond belief. To think that this was the true origin of the Slayer Legion. However, the words Hutch said next were even more shocking. "Wrong." One by one, Hutch called out Supremes and former Supremes, forcing them to speak of the Slayer Legion's history, yet, of them could come up with an answer that could satisfy the old man. In fact, with every mistake, Hutch's reprimanding only grew fiercer and harsher. "So this is the hogwash that's been taught." Hutch looked toward his grandson. "What is the history of the Slayer Legion?" Ellerin cleared his throat, the simple action somehow seeming elegant. It was simply impossible to believe that a single man could have such a level of charm. "We are the sacrifice. When alive, our wool keeps the people warm. On our deathbeds, our blood quenches the people's thirst. After our death, our flesh keeps the people fed." Ellerin's words shook those of the Slayer Legion to their souls. It was no longer about the voice that spoke them but entirely about the words themselves. It felt as though they had suddenly pulled their heads out from a vat of water, gasping for breath and finally seeing the world for what it truly was. The simple sentences tugged at their heartstrings, forcing their blood to rage like flooding torrents. However, Ellerin still hadn't finished. "We are the spearhead. Our shaft stands tall without us. Our head glistens beneath the sun when it is time and hides in the night when it is not. Do you understand?" Though the members of the meeting felt that their blood was boiling, they couldn't quite explain why. It was as though something hidden within them was slowly resurfacing, bubbling to the forefront of their minds. However, no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't quite understand what Ellerin was trying to say. What sacrifice? What spear? Ellerin glanced around him, his expression calm. "We are the Slayers. Our work is entertainment when the Emperor deems it fit. Our services are ostracized when he does not. Do you understand?" The upper echelon's expressions flushed red, their jaws clenching. "The Slayer Legion is..." Hutch began to speak in an even tone, his pace unhurried. "The hidden army of the Empire. In times of war, we join the battlefield to become their spearheads. In times of peace, we become their sacrifices. Now, Sharpen your spears. Chapter 549. Hutch's words left a pregnant silence over the room. It was hard for the upper echelon to properly wrap their heads around this matter, but somehow also easy for them to accept. The realization left them quaking internally. Just what level of manipulation and planning did it take to pull something like this off? Not only would it take the foresight necessary to realize that a nation could only be united when they had a common enemy, but it would also take a level of genius they could fathom to make those of the Slayer Legion accept this reality so long after their initial creation. The upper echelon members had long since been taught of the true origins of the Slayer Legion, but it wasn't until this moment that they understood their true hidden purpose. In truth, was this so different from their initial reality? Their main goal had been to protect the citizens of the Empire and to pave a better future for them. And now, their goal was the exact same. It was just that their spears were pointed in a different direction than where they expected. But now, they had another problem to face. While the upper echelon were properly indoctrinated and could accept this news with ease, the same couldn't possibly be true of their lower-ranking members. One just needed to think of existences like Big Buddha to understand just how much many of their people hated the Empire. No small number of their recruits were made up of those who loathed the Ascension Empire and wanted to live to the day it fell. But this was precisely where the genius of the Slayer Legion lay. It was created for this expressed purpose. And, with all the most powerful members knowing the truth behind this, it was almost too easy to control how much progress the Slayer Legion made toward that goal. This was the ultimate truth. Worrying about how those lower-ranking officials would react. Who said they needed to find out at all? Lionel sat in meditation, his internal sight stretching out over the city. White City was over 50 kilometers in diameter. If Earth was still a third-dimensional world, with his fourth-dimensional internal sight, Lionel wouldn't have an issue covering this distance. But, after entering the fourth dimension, it was much more difficult for Lionel to cover such a distance. In such a fledgling fourth-dimensional world, Lionel could at most cover 10 kilometers at best, and that was only thanks to his obscene sensory talents and in thanks to reaching completion in the Four Seasons realm, which seemed to have boosted him in all aspects. However, even this wasn't enough to cover the whole city. This was why Lionel had had no choice but to walk around the city slowly. His goal in traveling around the city had more to do with just finding the spies. Other than this, he also had to read the layout of the city and draw a map of the force art nodes littered throughout. When Lionel saw Hargrove City teleport for a second time, a light bulb went off for him. The only way for the city to have managed to do this was if there was a permanent teleportation force art drawn into its foundation. The reason for this was simple. Take a talisman, for example. They were usually one-time or limited-use items. This was because the drawing of a single force art had many limiting factors, whether that be the skill level of the one who drew it or the material it was drawn with. The easiest way to visualize this was in comparing the mage arts of Camelot to treasures created by force crafters. A mage art, once drawn onto the air, whether with no medium or with a spiritual wood-forged wand, would only last long enough for a single attack. Even stronger spells would last for a few seconds at most, while the longest-lasting spells like Lionel's Bell defensive spell would only survive a few attacks at most. By comparison, a treasure created by a force crafter was on a completely different level in terms of longevity. A well-crafted weapon could survive decades, even centuries of continuous battle. There were some weapons that had even existed for millions of years without issue. What was the main difference? The quality of material used to draw the force art. Force arts came in all different shapes, sizes, and even languages. But the one fundamental truth was that the medium used to draw them would always decide their longevity. So what was the point of all this? Why was it important at all? Well, it exposed one fundamental truth to Lionel, and that was that these cities weren't teleported here through one-time use treasures. The very foundation of these cities were force arts. One might think this wasn't very useful. Even if Lionel knew this, what could he possibly do about it? Even if he managed to use it, wouldn't it just be a teleportation force art? What was the use of bringing a city to a battlefield? From Terrain's perspective, this made sense because they were invading another's land. But Earth already had many well-established forts and cities that could put White City or Hargrove City to shame. Beyond this, since Terrain had drawn in permanent force arts, who knew if they had a greater purpose for them? What if, much like Hargrove City, Terrain had a method of snatching White City back? If that was the case, it might make Lionel's actions even more useless. All of this said, Lionel didn't see these matters in this fashion at all for a few reasons. Firstly, he believed his level of skill was beyond the crafter's Terrain employed to draw these force arts. Secondly, he had learned when he reconstructed Camelot's mage arts to amplify their strength that force arts could be considered complete sentences and paragraphs while the runes used to draw them were the words. In that case, such a large force art, just how many of these words could he rearrange? And what kind of new sentences could he form with them? But the third was the most important. With the sturdy materials used to draw this massive force art, Lionel felt that he could do something much better with all that wealth. Chapter 550. After confirming his vision, Lionel immediately got to work. He shuffled around the city like a madman, seemingly running around without aim or purpose. This could work. No, that might ruin the nodes at that place, but Lionel's gaze glowed. Despite the fact he was quickly growing beaten and haggard, his vision only seemed to become clearer. The truth was that Lionel's current body was still in a pretty terrible state, having not quite recovered from going all out just a few days ago. But, at this point, he didn't mind. He lost himself in a world of force arts, his mind functioning on a different plane. Lionel had many complicated feelings about Lionel, but what he couldn't deny was the fact that Lionel had opened up an all-new door toward improvement for him. What Lionel gave him wasn't as simple as a normal breakthrough, but rather a new way of viewing the world. After shrugging these shackles off, breaking into the peak of the Four Seasons realm was just the very tip of the iceberg. Lionel jumped into and out of his dream world, simulating the changes he wanted to make before quickly testing them out in the new world. Odd swirls of force seemed to manifest around White City, catching those with sharp enough senses off guard. But it was hard for them to tell exactly what was going on. From within the City Lord mansion, Aina watched as Lionel ran around, her smile tinged with a touch of worry. He's always like this. Aina shook her head, not bothering to try to get Lionel to stop. She knew that it would be useless even if the words came from her. Though it seemed like Lionel hung on her every word, maybe Aina was the one most aware of the fact that Lionel was too good at drawing a line between his emotions and what he felt he had to do. He was quite the stubborn man in that way. Taking a deep breath, Aina pulled out her great sword, brandishing it. Though much of the City Lord Mansion's military fields had been taken up by new residences, there was still ample room for Aina to take advantage of. She slowly swung her sword, her muscles twitching beneath the strain as she slowed her swing to a crawl. Aina had picked up the sword when she felt her comprehension of the battle axe had reached a bottleneck. Others might feel that this was a foolish thing to do, but Aina always trusted her instincts. When it came to the proper way for her to train herself, she was the very best at it. She felt that there were secrets in the sword that could bring her comprehension of the axe to an all-new level, so she began to diligently train in it. During her battle with Anared, that feeling she had grew even stronger. Though she was certain that Anared held back, he was still a master of the sword. His every action was infused with the air of a swordmaster. If Anared knew that his actions would help her break down a final barrier that had been holding her back, who knew how he would react? This is the feeling. Aina took a deep breath, her chest heaving in slow rhythms. At that moment, something miraculous occurred. Despite the fact her sword swing remained incomparably slow, the blade left an afterimage in the air as though leaving a permanent stain of its presence in the wind. The image shifted and slowed, waving about like illusions. That's it, Aina ingrained the twitch of every one of her muscle fibers onto her mind. Beads of sweat fell down her delicate brow, following the slope of her slender neck. Halfway down, Aina threw her sword to the side as though it was trash. At that moment, she felt that she no longer needed it. Until the next time her ability spoke to her, she wouldn't need any other weapon. Aina grasped out into empty air, causing her odd curved package to snap open. With a surge, a beautiful axe of golden red shot into her hand. Ha! Aina swung down with a forcefulness. At that moment, her aura completely changed. For those instances of time, her body exuded a mystique that demanded absolute obedience. The faint shadow of a woman more than half a foot taller than her seemed to envelop her body, causing the forces in the air to sing. A deep gash suddenly stretched out before Aina, even without her axe having completed its swing. After images of golden red tore through the wind, leaving a whistling resonance in their wake. Aina's arms came to a grinding halt, a final bead of sweat falling from the tip of her nose to the ground below. Completion. She said softly. If others knew that Aina had reached the completion stage of the Four Seasons realm, they would be shocked. Of course, her completion stage was only for the axe, while Lionel's was on a level that far transcended that. But it was a feat that would shock and awe others to no end, regardless. Aina smiled. My training is actually faster now. Aina felt that she had underestimated the value of a break on the mind. She had thought it would take her several more months to reach this stage, yet it had only taken a few more days. Now, she felt much more confident about entering Valiant Heart Mountain stage. After basking in her own success, Aina's next instinct was to tell Lionel the good news. She didn't know why she had the compulsion, but after she opened up to Lionel, she felt the weirdest joy even telling him the littlest things, even though the trade-off was learning that he was a milk-first sociopath. However, just when Aina wanted to do so, she felt another shift in the force surrounding the city. This change was particularly different from the previous ones. Whereas the former surges originated from within the city, this seemed to come from outside of it. What? Aina was shocked. Why does my body feel so sluggish? On a corner of earth, dead bodies laid strewn about. Their blood pooled and boiled, bubbling forth like a death-laced stew. To the side of this large pool, a familiar man stood, a placid smile on his face. If Aina had been there, it would have been no trouble to pick out that this man was other than the puppet master. But, what was maybe more sinister were the bodies and limbs floating within the bubbling concoction. At that moment, a head with a peeling layer of skin floated to the top. On its face, a look of horror and regret was forever etched. This was the face of former Vice Commander Joseph's younger brother, Damien. Chapter 551. Aina suddenly felt as though her body wasn't hers. There was a disconnect between her mind and body, as though one was being rejected from the other. It was hard to tell exactly which was happening, but the fundamental truth was that the disconnect made her feel as though her body wasn't her own. With a frown, Aina brandished her axe out of habit, just trying to do something she was familiar with. By now, she had long since lost count of the number of times she had swung her axe in her life. Lionel was always fascinated by her tanned skin, but wasn't that just the product of all the work she had put in ever since she was old enough to understand the cruelty of the world around her? There was nothing in this world that she was more familiar with than her axe. A swirl of universal force followed Aina's swing. For the first time since this oddity began, Aina felt as though she was back in her own body again. But, just when she thought it was alright to stop and her previous feelings had just been an anomaly, she felt the feeling come back the moment she stopped swinging her axe. In fact, now, due to the abrupt stop, the feeling was even more obvious than it had been before. It was like invisible shackles had suddenly been placed over her body. Aina's ability worked on instinct mostly and was only partially an actionable act taken up by herself. But, at this moment, that instinct seemed foggy. Whereas before she was certain of the next steps she had to take to train her body and improve her axe, at this moment she felt confused and baffled. Did I overuse my ability? Did I run into a bottleneck? A bit of worry mixed within a deep frown took over Aina's features. Was this really the limit of her talent? A slight hint of anxiety bubbled up within her heart. Unlike Lionel, Aina couldn't just pull out a dictionary and get a read on her ability. She was only aware that her ability was good, but she didn't know anything about its growth potential or even what stage it was at now. No. It can't be. It can't be. Aina's jaw steeled. Her talent was what she relied on to have a chance to avenge her mother in the future. If this was really her limit, she wouldn't be able to accept it. Aina's eyes reddened, a fury hidden within their depths. She refused to accept this. Even if this was the end of her road, she'd find a way to burst through it. The truth was that Aina didn't know how powerful the Brazinger family was. She didn't know how much effort it would take to take them down or what kind of backers they had. But to her, it never mattered. She would destroy them one day, no matter the cost. Aina? At that moment, Lionel's voice drifted to her ears, snapping her out of her thoughts. Lionel looked worriedly toward his girlfriend. Without her mask on, it was easy for Lionel to read her mood. He could see the cycle of emotions Aina was going through. But, he couldn't understand what was wrong. Did something happen? Are you okay? What happened? Lionel scanned Aina's face and body as though trying to find any injuries she might have, but he didn't see what could be wrong. Lionel's gaze suddenly sharpened. The sight was subtle, so subtle that even he almost missed it. If it wasn't for the fact he had been determined to find out what was wrong with Aina, he would have overlooked it entirely. At that moment, a faint reddish-black gas hung around Aina's body. It was so faint that it seemed to blend in with Aina's tan skin almost seamlessly. Lionel's gaze flashed, two golden pupils suddenly appearing to his back. If anyone else faced these eyes, it would feel as though they were bearing their very soul before Lionel. For a person, such a feeling should have been uncomfortable and off-putting. Yet, for Aina, she somehow didn't find anything wrong with it. In fact, her beating heart seemed to calm considerably. Beneath Lionel's shadow, she found peace again. However, while she felt at peace, Lionel's expression twisted, a flickering rage erupting within the depths of his gaze. The eyes of the snowy star owl were part of its wisdom branch. At this moment, Lionel had still yet to unlock the second tier of his wisdom branch lineage factor. As such, he could only use the most basic abilities of the snowy star owl's gaze. But, that was more than enough for him to sharpen his gaze by several levels. The faint reddish-black suddenly morphed in Lionel's eyes. It formed into an illusory leech, latching onto Aina's body. At first, Lionel was infuriated, thinking that this was related to Aina's curse again. There was even a part of him that wanted to abandon Earth at this very moment and go explore fifth-dimensional worlds so he could find the things she needed to be cured. But, upon second inspection, he found that the leech was connected by a faint line that shot into the skies. The line grew so thin and transparent that after a few dozen meters, even Lionel couldn't follow it any longer. This isn't her curse? What's going on? AI. It seems that I've finally found you, my queen. The moment this voice entered her ears, Aina's expression froze, her body flexing so hard that it began to tremble. Several blood vessels ruptured, leaving a flowerbed of crimson trailing up and down her mostly flawless skin. Lionel's head turned back to Aina. Seeing her reaction, he felt his heart froze over. It was as though the woman he cared for most was right before him, but he couldn't even protect her. She was no further than half a meter from him, yet it felt like she was worlds away, blocking her off from reality. Aina seemed to have rejected all outside influences, clenching her fists so hard that blood dripped from her palms. Go. Bring me my queen, puppets. At that moment, the faint reddish-black line that extended from Aina's body thickened by several levels. In fact, with Lionel's gaze, he suddenly found that the city was covered in these lines suddenly. It was in that instant that Lionel understood that it wasn't just Aina affected by these leeches. And, unfortunately, the people of the capital were quickly learning this as well. Chapter 552. The capital of the Ascension Empire was just as gorgeous as one might imagine. Even if you spent your whole life dreaming, building up a fanciful image of what it might be like, you would still find yourself stunned beyond compare. The capital of Earth was like a blooming flower. Its lowest layer spread out like the petals of a lily, intricate lines drawing the roads and residences where there would have been the veins of a flower. The second layer of the capital of Earth shot upward like the trunk of an ancient tree. Its branches and foliage formed the quarters of the wealthy and noble. It rose into the skies taller than any mountain to ever exist on Earth, reaching heights never before seen. The final layer of the capital of Earth was like the canopy of this ancient tree. Even from down below, one could see the brilliant precious metals and gems that reflected the sunlight. But, compared to the astounding wealth, the nature captured the heart and refused to let go. The sparkling waters of falls sprayed into the air, leaving a perpetual rainbow hanging over the capital. Lush greenery perfectly melded into the high-tech society, making one feel refreshed with every breath. Stars twinkled in its sky, balls of lights hovering about seemingly without aim that made the city seem more like a fantasy land than a true place. And, in the center of it all, there was the palace. No matter where you stood in the capital, it was possible to see this magnificent building. It loomed over top like a protector, existing above all. It had the rounded edges of ancient Indian architecture, the feng shui of ancient Chinese botany, the grandeur of ancient American skyscrapers, the innovation of ancient Middle Eastern vision. It existed on a plane of its own and was the symbol of the Fox royal family. However, at this moment, a capital that had even taken the citizens of a fourth-dimensional world like terrain aback, was under siege from all sides. Of course, it had been like this for a long time already. However, those who surrounded the base of the capital, trying to gain a foothold on its large, curling petals, had never been able to make much progress at all. Though the capital was a gorgeous sight to behold, it was also an impenetrable fortress the size of an entire province. The beautifully formed flower petals at the base of the capital, each larger than the size of a main city, gave the people of Earth a perpetual higher ground advantage. By the time one got to the tree trunk of the second layer, one would have already exhausted much of their resources, only to have to fight another uphill battle. As though this wasn't bad enough, the canopy and the highest third layer was yet another challenge to behold. Without certain strategic points, the only choice to reach the highest layer would be to fly or climb. If one chose flight, you would be asking for death. And if one chose climbing, you would be asking for death. The entire capital was practically a death trap. Or, rather, that's what it began as. The tides of the battle began to shift. For some unknown reason, the citizens of Earth began to feel sluggish and their abilities became less receptive to their calls. In fact, if it wasn't for the terrain advantage, the people of Earth would have been bulldozed over already. On a battlefield on a northern petal, Noah's expression changed. He pulled Jessica back from the blade of a soldier of terrain, his leg extending and blowing the soldier back. "What is wrong with you?" Noah frowned. He held on to Jessica's slender arm and spun her toward himself. But, even then, she seemed to react slowly. Jessica raised a hand to her forehead. I don't know. I don't feel too good." Noah looked around him, shocked by what was happening. He thought it was just Jessica at first, but soon the number grew. From Nile to Nika to even the members of the Dove family entourage, everyone's combat prowess seemed to plummet. There were a few that were doing better, but Noah couldn't tell why. As for those completely unaffected, there was only him and Tyrion who didn't seem to experience any issues. Noah's expression changed. "Watch out." Niall's parry was too slow. He was used to relying on his ability to hold down his enemies, but for some reason, he found it impossible to do so now. No, it wasn't that it was impossible, but rather that there seemed to be a disconnect between him and his ability, almost as though he was no longer as familiar with it as he used to be. His spear missed the mark and a sword suddenly ran through his shoulder, slicing through his ribs and lungs before plunging toward his heart. Niall coughed up a mouthful of blood, his control over his spear faltered, causing it to slip from his grip and clang to the ground. Damn it. Noah's fury rose, his body increasing in size as he punched the responsible soldier into a meat paste. The youth troops stood around Niall, watching his life drift away. Was he really dying? Despite all the dangerous situations they had been in, the youth troops had never lost a single member. Not once. Their talent was too great, and even when they ran into trouble, they always managed to find a way out of it. The closest any of them had ever come to death was when Niall faced Lionel. But, even then, they had been facing one of their own. Lionel was one of them. This was the first time their lives had ever been on the line against a person of terrain. Retreat. Niall roared. I said, retreat. All across Earth, repeats of these matters seemed to wind on like the rerun of a sick movie. Earth had less people, but they made it up with their talent. Earth had weaker foundations, but they made it up with their talent. Earth was just a fledgling world, but they made it up with their talent. What would they do, then? If that talent disappeared? Chapter 553. Lionel stood in silence. In the skies, the lines of red-black grew thicker, the leeches become less and less illusory. Lionel's gaze shifted down from the skies, landing on Aina, who still seemed to be immobile. Though it now seemed to be in part due to struggling against the puppet master's growing control, a large majority of it seemed to be fear. Lionel found it hard to believe that this was his Aina. Fear was never an emotion he had seen her display before. At the very least, not for the sake of an enemy. It could be said that the first time Lionel saw Aina's facade crack was that day in the bathhouse. He could still remember the path every tears that fell down her cheeks took. He remembered the exact hue of her reddened eyes, the way her wet hair had stuck to her face, the way she trembled through each and every one of her clumsy actions. The emotions she experienced that day were all seared into his mind. But, that was that and this was this. The Aina he knew charged into war with her axe brandished and her blade bloodied. She had no fear, none of the shyness she usually displayed, and the valiant nature of a Valkyrie. But Aina, his Aina, stood here shaking simply due to a voice. Lionel remembered back to the time he asked Aina what happened that day. She reeled back, trying to pretend as though everything was fine. Yet he, instead of trying to understand where she was coming from, pulled back instead. He hadn't understood the fear she was feeling, the anxiety, or the trepidation. He didn't grasp the fact that just recalling such memories were this difficult for her already, let alone having to relay them to someone else. Lionel took a step forward and caressed Aina's cheek. She still seemed to be lost in her own world, clenching her fists and staring down at the ground hard as though to push the emotions she was feeling away. She didn't want to experience such a reaction, she didn't want this puppet master to have such control over her, yet she couldn't stop her own visceral reaction. Even when Lionel touched her cheek, she didn't react until several moments later. It was as though the warmth of his palm couldn't reach her even through skin-to-skin contact. When Aina finally realized that Lionel was standing right before her, she looked up weakly, her gaze tinted with a slight red. Lionel could see the rage in them. It wasn't rage pointed toward the puppet master or even him. It was rage she pointed toward herself for being so weak, for allowing such emotions to have such a hold on her. I can't move again. Aina said softly. It doesn't matter. Lionel responded, his hand gently pushing back Aina's hair. I'll kill him. The words were simple. They hung in the air like a spring breeze, riding the wind. There was no rage in Lionel's voice, there was only gentleness. Lionel had always hated to kill. But for Aina, he could speak such words as though they were nothing. Aina used what control of her body she did have to lean her head onto Lionel's palm. Her eyes closed and her breathing steadied. I want to see it, she said softly. Lionel smiled. As my queen commands. Lionel's voice carried a tinge of iciness that left Aina feeling completely at ease. To appear on his world, sending commandments down from above, speaking of taking his woman. The puppet master was truly tired of living. Aina smiled lightly hearing Lionel's words. Compared to when the puppet master called her such a thing, she felt as though she was hearing the most soothing thing in existence. Lionel moved his hand away, ripping the tops of his robes off to reveal a muscular frame. He carried Aina onto his back, tying her to him. The warmth of Lionel's skin put Aina at ease. She rested her cheek onto his shoulder and back, her eyes remaining closed. She didn't want Lionel to see the look in her eye, the look that told the world just how furious she was at this moment. Lionel could feel that his body still hadn't properly recovered. It had only been a day since the battle at Dark Cloud Prison, so how could it? However, at this moment, he felt blood rushing through his every being. His heart thumped like war drums, his blood flooding through his veins and arteries like crashing waterfalls. By this point, the thickening lines that shot into the sky began to converge on Lionel's position. When Lionel saw who they were, he wasn't very surprised. In fact, his gaze was cold and indifferent, a fury within his chest slowly bubbling upward. The patrol guards of White City struggled, trying to break free of the control the illusory leeches had on them. But, no matter how hard they tried, they continued to walk forward, each brandishing their own weapons. In a distant place, the puppet master sat in a vat of blood. The only adornment on its body was a familiar headpiece that hung from its forehead. The pressure radiating around it was palpable, reaching levels that shouldn't have been possible. Or at least, it didn't seem possible for the ignorant. The barrier between dimensions could be considered like a separation between mortality and immortality. A person of a higher dimension was like a god looking down on their subjects. Lionel's father had force-fed a lot of ancient entertainment down his son's throat. If the strength of a dimensional being were to be described through this lens, it would be most straightforward to say that at the lowest echelons, a dimensional being was essentially at the beginning of their journey, while at the highest, they were nearing godhood. What did all of this mean? This was all to say that comparing someone who had just entered the fourth dimension to someone a half step from the fifth was like comparing someone at the bottom of a world to someone at the top. If a fifth-dimensional being was a god to a fourth-dimensional being, then someone like the puppet master was a demigod. This demigod watched as Lionel strapped Aina to his back, a cold expression on its face. But that was when Lionel looked up into the sky as though piercing his gaze through the veil to land on the puppet master. Lionel didn't speak any words, but his demeanor made it all as clear as possible. He was coming, so wash your neck. Chapter 554. Lionel's gaze pierced through the skies, bronze runes flickering across his body. A tan sheen swept across his skin as though he had suddenly become a polished metal. Puppet master, huh? Lionel flipped his palm, a black spear with countless dangling chains appeared in his hand. Clang! 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 Lionel looked down from the skies, a swath of patrol units converging onto his location. At first, they all showed some level of resistance, but very soon, their gazes became vacant, their eyes glazing over as their movements became more coordinated. Soon, they moved as though they were a single army. The possibility that Aina could be turned against him didn't escape Lionel, but he didn't put up any guards against her. This wasn't because he was a fool, but rather because he trusted her. Though there were few details about Aina that he understood, what he did grasp was her character. She was a woman he would be proud to have by his side. There wasn't a single selfish bone in her body. Since she opened her mouth to speak of wanting to see him take down the puppet master, it was because she was certain that she wouldn't be a burden. And in that, Lionel could trust. Watch carefully, then. This back of mine, these shoulders, these hands. Lionel felt his body flex, vitality pumping through him without end. They'll always be here to protect you. These were the ideals of a man. Lionel shot forward, a field of gravity erupting around his body. His gaze steeled, his heart freezing over. He no longer saw the patrolling units as humans. He saw them as numbers and figures, puppets that were standing in his way. Lionel's feet shifted, illusory wings appearing to his back as he shot forward with blinding speed. He appeared before the front line of patrol units, raising his spear into the skies. His back flexed, his arms bulged, a fury-laced aura skyrocketed around him, suffocating all those in his presence. With a single cleave, a patrol guard was completely bisected. Blood splashed along the ground, but there wasn't a single scream or shout. A deadpan expression covered the face of the deceased guard as though he hadn't felt any remorse even about his own death. Or maybe, the moment he lost his mind to the puppet master. He was already dead. A steamy breath left Lionel's lips, his gaze cold. He stood amidst hundreds of guards, his presence malevolent. His fists gripped around his spear's shaft, the flowing of his blood growing even faster. With another swing, Lionel reaped another life. His strike was so ferocious that his spear bowed beneath his strength, smashing the patrolling guard into the ground with mere wind pressure before his blade even reached his neck. Lionel's footwork accelerated, his movements becoming like flowing water. He danced through the organized army of puppets as though he didn't know fatigue, as though he didn't know pain. Every blow was just as powerful as the last, if not more powerful. His body fed off a seemingly endless supply of energy, powering through without end. The citizens of White City had no idea what was happening. They didn't understand why a civil war had suddenly erupted between the people of Earth, and many weren't entirely sure how to react to such a change. Should they be running? Escaping? Which side should they be fighting alongside? Was this maybe a trap? Within the dungeon, the obese merchant looked up and through the bars. He noticed the odd actions of the guards all the way up until they left their stations entirely. At first, he thought they might have been changing shifts, but it seemed that things weren't so simple. The lip of the obese merchant curled. So this is the trump card terrain mentioned? Quite a trump card indeed. Lionel's spear clanged with every strike, a new life falling with his every swing. Blood flew about him like the droplets of a painting, his skin reddening and steam practically billowing out from his mouth with his every movement. His muscles were like tightened cords, his limbs like the instruments of a symphony. His expressions exhibited the focus of a starving artist, his offensive prowess embodying every ounce of their passion. It was as though Lionel wanted Aina to feel his strength, to feel his power through the endless thrumming of his heart. Lionel's spear pierced through a final head, hundreds of corpses lying beneath his feet. Blood caked his blade, dripping across his body as though he had just been beneath a rain of crimson. Another heated breath left Lionel's lips. A scorching heat billowed outward, boiling the air and causing it to crackle. Raging fire elemental force surged around Lionel, causing the temperature to skyrocket. He looked up into the skies, his irises flickering with a violet-red color. An icy portal began to open. A harsh clash of elements caused hurricane-force winds to kick up across the city. Slowly, a massive white wolf prowled out, a low, rumbling growl causing the hearts of those who heard it to seize. Behind it, knights dressed in armors of ice walked, brandishing polearm weapons of all sorts. At that moment, cracks of lightning suddenly shot across Lionel's dreamscape, his gaze shining as a blistering heat continued to crackle the air around him. The attack on the fort. That had ended in a failure due to Lionel's action. However, the attack on Dark Cloud Prison hadn't ended in failure. Those two occurrences seemed to have nothing to do with one another, but there was a fine line of truth connecting them both, the puppet master. Those red-black lines. They carried with them a thick scent of blood, but it wasn't just any blood, it was the blood of people of Earth. Just like Lionel could see through the subtle changes in energy that separated people of different worlds, he could just as easily see through the subtle fluctuations of energy that were unique to the people of Earth as well. I see. Those prisoners are dead, Lionel finally understood. The puppet master likely needed the thousands of Earthener lives to accomplish his goal, but he had failed to get what he needed with Royal Blue Fort, so he had to change his plans. Compared to attacking a fort where the people didn't want to escape, wasn't it easier to attack a fort where everyone wanted to escape? And they all fell right into his lap. At that moment, another portal appeared. This time, it was a red wolf followed by knights adorned in magma-like armor. Then, there was yet another. In this one, a sand-colored wolf followed by knights adorned in earth-like armor appeared. And then there was a final portal. In this one, a green wolf followed by knights adorned with illusory wind-like armor appeared. Lionel stood at the center of these four groups, Aina still strapped to his back. Corpses littered his surroundings, blood slowly dripping from the end of his blade and down his body. He closed his eyes, the thumping of his heart and the aching of his body playing in his ears. It seems Earth is in trouble. Lionel thought silently. In any other case, I might not care much. My top priority is Aina's safety and her happiness. I may very well have chosen to escape this world at this very moment. But, you just had to piss me off. The ground beneath Lionel began to rumble. Chapter 555. Lionel brandished his spear, blocking the swipe of a devastating claw attack. His body rattled and shook, his internal organs threatening to shear apart beneath the strain. However, his gaze remained cold and indifferent, as though the frigid energies of the white wolf couldn't impact him in the slightest. The flickering runes across his body solidified. In that moment, whatever jarring inner injuries he felt weakened considerably, his gaze meeting the white-blue irises of the wolf before him. Little Black Star. Lionel hardly finished his thought before an adorable little mink appeared by his side. After observing the situation, the little guy bore his fangs, his hair standing up on end. Lionel retreated as Blackstar sent a furious claw swipe forward, causing scythes of dark energy to tear through the air and forcing the white wolf back. The red wolf appeared in Lionel's path of retreat, his teeth spilling over with billowing flames. It opened its jaws, a jagged row of glistening white being accompanied by a blistering heat. As though a dragon, its throat flexed and its chest expanded. Due to the size differences, Lionel could clearly see the ball of flames forming and building up. It bubbled like magma, causing a slight red glow to appear at the wolf's throat. The red armored knights trudged forward, their polearm weapons sweeping toward Lionel as though they didn't fear the fiery breath of the red wolf in the slightest. Shoo! The forward force of the red wolf's breath was so great that its body skidded backward, its claws leaving deep marks in the ground. Lionel watched as this ball of fire made its way toward him. It scorched the air, revolving at dangerous speeds and reflecting colors of red, orange, and gold. The air around it seemed to disappear into a vat of billowing smoke, the temperature of the surroundings increasing to the point where it seemed that anyone standing within its radius would be burnt to ash. However, Lionel continued to watch it as though he couldn't sense the numerous blade blocking his path or see the looming danger in the slightest. Just when it seemed that Lionel would be burnt to a crisp, he reached out a hand. In that instant, the fireball which had already crossed speeds of hundreds of miles per hour grinded to a halt, resting on Lionel's outstretched palm as though it was a normal ball rather than a 3-meter-tall monstrosity. Lionel's hand swiped across. As though an obedient pet, the ball of fire suddenly accelerated, shooting across the battlefield and slamming into the white wolf. The sound of roars and whimpers sounded, the white wolf losing more than half its vitality in an instant. No matter how hard it had tried to dodge, it simply couldn't. First it had to deal with Blackstar's claw swipe, but before it could even do so, its own partner's attack suddenly bore down upon it, nearly taking its head off. A resonance softer than even an assassin's footsteps appeared to Lionel's back. Its actions were so swift and controlled that there wasn't even the slightest wind pressure associated with its actions. The green wolf's fangs glistened, biting down toward Lionel with every intention of swallowing him whole. It seems it didn't work. Though Lionel thought this, his actions weren't slow in the slightest. Ha! Lionel released his universal force, tapping into the Four Seasons realm once again and fusing it with the gravity field of his bronze runes. The instant he did, the minor uptick in gravity suddenly rose explosively. The speed of the green wolf plummeted, its open jaw crashing down into the ground with such force that its mouth snapped and its teeth cracked. Lionel had wanted to use the little mink's beast control ability to wrest ownership of these wolves away. But, clearly this wasn't possible. The puppet master's control ability was far beyond that of the white knight Lionel stole this ability from. In that case, he would just have to take another. Lionel suddenly coughed up a mouthful of blood, the strain of using the Four Seasons realm impacting him once again. But, he pretended as though nothing had happened, strong spear forces swirling around him as he slashed downward. Little Black Star. Black Star ripped its way out of the white wolf's body, his little frame and once lush black fur coated in an eerie crimson. Take this ability for yourself. The moment Lionel's words finished, he completed his final slash. His mind was filled with images of a burly man with a chest packed with dense hair. He stood alone in the woods, a darkness pervading his surroundings. The chirps of birds set his rhythm and his beating heart stilled to a crawl. He rose an axe above his head, his muscles subtly writhing beneath his coat of hair. His movements were slow, but controlled, a beautiful rhythm hidden within them. Then, he chopped down, splintering a thick piece of wood in two. Lionel's image and the image of the mane overlapped. His actions seemed to be fueled by nature's pulse, carrying a tempo that made them impossible to dodge. The green wolf's head was split in two in that very instant, its body vanishing into countless motes of light before much blood could be spilt. The little mink appeared to Lionel's side, grasping with his little claws and causing a shadow to form. Without hesitation, the little guy swallowed it. A strong wind suddenly enveloped the little mink, his body becoming surrounded with foggy green-black energies. With a leap, the little mink found his place on Lionel's head. In that moment, Lionel felt that the disconnect he had once had with wind elemental force suddenly vanished. In fact, the force-strengthening deviation had never been clearer to him than it was now. Float. Lionel shot into the air, dodging an attempted strike by the sand-colored wolf. Unfortunately for it, beneath the force field of Lionel's metal synergy lineage factor, it hadn't been able to use any of its abilities at all. In the blink of an eye, Lionel stood over 100 meters in the air. His cold gaze looked down toward the ground as a jet-black surfboard appeared beneath his feet. Lionel stretched out a hand, his internal sight connecting with the nodes of the city. A coldness pervaded the air, filling it with a lurking scent of death. Despite the fact they were puppets with hardly any emotions of their own, the knights and two remaining wolves below trembled unconsciously, the last bits of their humanity shining through in their final moments. Die. Space suddenly warped and twisted. By the time it settled back down, there was nothing but a crater left. However, this crater had edges so smooth that it caused one to shiver. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.